Okay, good evening, people. Welcome to today's podcast. My name is Ronaldo, and today I'm accompanied by American video game critic Jed Pressgrove. How are you doing, Jed?
I'm doing very well, Ronaldo, and thank you very much for asking me to come aboard.
It's my pleasure, and thank you for accepting. Pressgrove is a critic with a comparative style whose thoughts often fall outside of the consensus of the gaming press. And I invited him to talk today about spirituality in video games. The topic of spirituality isn't usually well covered by journalists or critics, and thus we are interested in discussing how it is explored in the medium, both by the games themselves and by the press. Okay, Jed, before starting, there was one question in Twitter that I felt we should cover first, and I usually don't do this, but the thing is that this question is from user Bascu03, and he asked what our definition of spirituality in video games is. And that's probably important because we need to make sure that we establish first what we are talking about. So, what do you understand about the idea of spirituality to begin with?
Yeah, I think that is a very appropriate question, and I'm glad that you started with that. So I think let's start with just spirituality in and of itself. What do I mean when I say spirituality? And to me, the way that I define it is spirituality is the idea of getting closer to a higher being or a higher state. So the reason why I make that distinction is because if you're a Christian, which I'm a Christian, I believe in a higher being. So, my idea of spirituality is growing closer to God. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
if I were Islamic, then I would want to get closer to Allah. Well, not all religions have a higher being. You take Buddhism. Uh, Nirvana is emphasized there, but that's
Mm-hmm.
a higher state of being. And so that's my definition of spirituality, is just getting closer to these sorts of things. Now, when we talk about spirituality in video games, does the video game comment about what I just talked about? Or does the video game make someone feel something about this sort of thing? In other words, I don't think that a video game is particularly spiritual if it merely has references to, say, a church or something like that. To me, that is potentially just a superficial marker. Like someone might use a church in a video game to express this idea of positivity or hope or peace. And I'm not saying that's necessarily negative, but I don't find it particularly spiritual because it doesn't really force me to grapple with concerns that have been, basically in the interest of humankind for millennia. So I hope that clarifies what we're talking about, at least from my perspective.
Yes, I agree with you in that regard. To me, is when I talk about spirituality, I talk about the practice as well to elevate our spirit and to have a, as you said, a connection to a higher state of being. And well, that's mostly what religions generally have to do about. They, for example, you mentioned Christianism. We attempt to return to the heavenly Father's presence, uh, uh, and that's mostly what our life goal ultimately is when it comes to Christianity. And well, in the case of video games, I also take into account how is that video games to allow us uh, to to a personal self growth through perhaps through the mechanics or perhaps through their their message, uh, like how they help to improve, how they can actually help us to improve our spirits in that sense. I don't know if I'm being clear enough.
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying, and it's a great idea. This idea of a video game through its mechanics or through its message, as you put it, uh, basically giving us something to think about. When it comes to our spiritual state.
Hmm.
Now, And that's the same with any art form, the same thing with movies. There are so many movies out there that whenever I watch them, they move me in a different way, and it's the same thing with music. There's a lot of music out there that has an emphasis on spirituality, this idea of having faith, or when you're down and out, you feel like you're in the lowest part of your life, and just being able to find some sort of hope, through a higher power. So video games are not unique in this sense, but they can do it in a different way, as you said, through mechanics. Movies don't have mechanics in the way that we think about them with video games.
Mm-hmm.
Now, here's the thing that is this is what makes this topic complicated, is that consuming video games and or consuming any kind of art can actually make you less spiritual. In other words, if your life is consumed by different pieces of art that don't really have a spiritual message, or in the case of a video game, don't have a spiritual message or mechanics that kind of express spiritual concepts, if all you're focusing on is stuff like that, then it can definitely lead you astray, so to speak, if that's all you're concentrating on. And that's definitely something that I want to talk more about later on in this conversation. But that's just something I'd like to throw out there, is that video games can conceivably draw us closer to our spiritual goals, but they can also push us away from those goals.
Right. And I feel that it perhaps has to do with how a lot of video games try to distract us from the actual world that is happening, and well, because a lot of them are unfortunately power fantasies that try to make us feel better about ourselves, and not necessarily make us conscious about ourselves, just to make us feel, they just try to make us feel good, which and thus they can distract us from the world. I don't know if you agree with that.
Right, right, yes, and I think there's a lot of different ways that we can describe this type of thing. I think escapism is something that
Right.
is a word that comes to mind. That's a word that a lot of people use. Now, here's something that I find interesting when it comes to this word escapism. Whenever it's used in the context of an artistic medium like video games or like movies, television shows, whatever. Escapism. What do people normally talk about escaping from when they talk about escapism? I think that they tend to talk about, and again, this is just people in general. If we go to a church, they would obviously have a more spiritual emphasis, but just people in general, they're often going to talk about, hey, I want to get away from politics. I hate the political status of my country right now, and I just want to get away from that. I want to have this power fantasy, something that you referred to earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe their grandmother just died, or someone else close to them died, and they want to get away from the grief. Or maybe their job sucks. Maybe their boss is insufferable, and they don't want to think about that anymore, and so they want to escape. So I think that typically is what people are talking about. But something that is even more important, I would argue, is that video games allow us to escape from our spiritual obligations, from our spiritual selves.
Mm-hmm. What and why do you say this? Because when we approach those video games that distract us, perhaps you you you, you imply that when we focus too much on escaping, then perhaps we ignore our well, in the case of of religious peoples like us, perhaps that we forget our spiritual responsibilities with other people, or perhaps with our religion. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, that is what I mean. And what's interesting about this concept of being distracted by something like a video game, all the religions, to my knowledge, have some commentary about the danger of being distracted. So, for example, I'm a Christian, like I mentioned earlier, and I think to a verse that is from, I believe it's from First Colossians. I believe it's chapter 3, verses 1 and 2.
Mm-hmm.
And it talks about basically if you say that you believe in Christ, you need to focus on things that are above rather than things that are on this world. And so that's a very clear message. So if I'm always playing a game and always thinking about it all the time and it has nothing to do with spiritual concepts, then I might be, in a manner of speaking, in violation of the purpose behind behind those verses that I just referenced.
Mm-hmm.
I was actually looking through verses in the Quran before this podcast. I'm not very familiar with the Quran, but I decided to look up some different things about being distracted, and there's this one verse in the Quran that I felt was powerful because it makes direct reference to people who believe, and it says believers do not let your, and I'm just paraphrasing here because I'm not an expert on the text, but basically this one translation said believers, do not let your possessions or your children distract you from the remembrance of God. Basically the idea of just thinking about God. And then it goes on to say, uh, if you do this, then you are truly the losers. So that's another example of religion drawing
Mm-hmm.
attention to this concept. And then I know that there are certain segments of Buddhism that believe that the cycles of this world are a distraction from the idea of achieving nirvana. So you can't achieve nirvana if you're always thinking about things that are going on around you in this world. And so I think to an extent, all the religions uh, want people to beware, of potential distractions, and so escapism definitely plays into this. And if I may, if it would be appropriate now, I would like to talk about one of my favorite video games of all time,
Mm-hmm.
and why I think that it is the most spiritually powerful game that I've ever played.
Okay. Per- um, well, perhaps we could. It would be appropriate for us to explain. Okay, we have talked perhaps about the general situation of the topic and why do you consider
Mm-hmm.
to be relevant to talk about it. But perhaps you could talk a bit of your background with spirituality, like so that people have I so that people have a general idea of your experiences with spirituality, religion in your life.
Okay, yeah. I think that is a good direction before I go into. And the game, by the way, is Earthbound,
Mm-hmm.
so everyone can just keep that in their heads while I go on about my background. So I'll
Mm-hmm.
come back to that. But yeah, so my background, I'll tell you about it. So I was raised in a Christian household. Specifically, the denomination was Southern Baptist. Now, at this point, I still consider myself a Christian because I subscribe to what the gospel talks about. The gospel, in this case, being the first four books of the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And I still subscribe to what that's talking about, and I still subscribe to the Bible, but I don't necessarily identify with any denomination. And the
Mm-hmm.
reason why I don't at this point is because, well, if you really start to study denominations, you get into some sticky territory.
Mm-hmm.
I know that there are a lot of people who are driven to atheism because of the hypocrisy that goes on in a lot of churches. And I don't necessarily want to be associated with, I guess, what you could loosely call organized hypocrisy. I'm not saying that all churches are bad and all church leaders are bad. I'm just saying that there's enough of it out there where it can actually drive someone away from God. Um, and also, I don't think that there's anything in the Bible, based on my reading, that tells me, hey, Jed, you definitely need to be a Southern Baptist, or hey, Jed, you definitely need to become Catholic. To me, there's nothing in the Bible that tells me that. To me, the Bible tells me that Jesus Christ is my Savior, and that
Mm-hmm.
through Him, through His grace, I can become closer to God, as you said earlier, the Heavenly Father. And now, to be honest with you, I went to church all the time when I was growing up. We went anytime the church doors were open. And this went on until I became an adult and I moved away. and I started going to college. And at that point, I stopped going to church as much because I wanted to focus more on my own freedom.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't necessarily think that it was important to become a spiritually deeper person. I wanted to go to college. I wanted to learn what I could. I wanted to start my career. I wanted to, quite frankly, go party and have fun with women and drink and all these sorts of things. And I think for a good period of my life, this is what was going on. And over the years, I'm about to turn 36. Over the years, I have started questioning why I did that. Why was I not running from God, but because I still prayed here and there and I still believed, but why didn't I consider it that important? And some different things happened to me. For example, I was married at one point, but then I got divorced.
Mm-hmm.
And as you know, when you get married, if you're a religious person, you make an oath to God and everyone standing before you. And so I kind of went back on that because it just didn't work. And I think an experience like that, and also just the foundation that was passed on to me by my parents, they always talk to me about God. They still do. And so and then I have some of my close friends are also Christians, and so I would see them talking about it, and these sorts of things just kept it creeping within me. It started to grow a little bit as I had become distracted, from it for so many years, and particularly in the last couple of years, I believe that I've grown much closer to God because now when I go through life and I have conversations with people, and I'm talking about a lot of times just strangers or people I don't know very well, there seems to be some purpose behind it. Maybe they've just gone through something and they're struggling with it, and they start talking about their spiritual state. And then that gives me an opportunity to share what I've been through. And I've been put in these situations a lot in the last couple of years. And I do think that there is some level of providence that's going on. And so definitely in the last couple of years, I've become a much more spiritual person. I've been reading my Bible more, I've been praying more, and I've been thinking more philosophically about what I'm doing, including why do I play video games?
Mm-hmm.
Am I just trying to escape from something? Am I doing it because I've always played video games? I've been playing since I was 5 years old. Am I doing it because, um, I need to overcome some challenge, because video games are full of those? So I've been asking a lot more questions. A lot. I've been asking the question why a lot more in the last couple of years.
I understand. It seems like you have had a particular deep connection with religion and spirituality since your childhood, and that once you have started to question some of the things that you did as a uh, as, as a young adult, to say the least, um, you started to realize that you wanted to become closer to God. Is that right? How I'm describing it?
Yes, yes. I think after a lot of thought, I recognized that there's an emptiness within me, and I think this is something that a lot of human beings have to deal with. Is things can be going pretty well actually sometimes even, but yet you still feel this emptiness. And I'm not necessarily talking about depression, although people who suffer from it I think could definitely maybe identify with what I'm talking about, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking about just even if you're not depressed, like still feeling like there's something missing. And I think that is the realization that I had, is that there is an emptiness within me. And I think that I try to fill it with certain things. So, video games is one of those things. I might play so many video games during a given year, not just because I want to write about them, but that is a big reason why I love writing about them. It's something that I dreamed about doing when I was a kid. I would
Mm-hmm.
pick up these gaming magazines and I would read the reviews, and I would think, man, this is just cool. And I wanted to write about them because I had my own opinions about them. Maybe I didn't agree with what this magazine was saying, and so so me writing about games and playing them, uh, it fills this emptiness, but it doesn't have an everlasting effect, though, if that makes sense. In other words, it's always about, well, what's next? And what I have found, whenever I concentrate on my spirituality, on my connection to God, I get I have a much more satisfied feeling when it comes to that empty part of me. In other words, I start to feel like that empty part of me is actually becoming more whole. If that makes sense.
No, I understand what you're saying. I feel like I have similar, somewhat similar experience to you because when I was also raised in a Christian family, particularly in a Catholic family, and a
Mm-hmm.
lot of my younger experience comes from interests that I had by myself. One of my biggest interests is literature, and since we had the Bible at home, I read through it as a kid many times, and and I had that, and even back then I had a powerful sentiment that, especially when I read the Book of Revelation, that I was reading something sacred and pure, and I felt that it had to come from divine inspiration. And I also talked to my uncle who was an evangelical pastor. Like he wasn't Catholic, he was an evangelical pastor, and I also garnered knowledge from him. But naturally, like any adolescent that starts to become skeptical, I also began to question these things, and also began to wonder about if what I had learned about religion and God's existence was true, since a lot of what I saw in reality didn't seem to add up to me personally, because people are mean to each other through history, and a lot of them even used religion as their excuse to act like that. And well, as you said, there have been accusations of priests committing horrible acts, which I don't want to go in
Mm-hmm.
depth. And well, the concept of God by itself is something that feels very abstract to grasp for, especially for a teenager that was that I used to be. Um, because there is this paradox of a benevolent God allowing evil to exist in the world, and that didn't match the notion of the Abrahamic God that we are taught when we are raised as Christians. But but and at that moment, being a Christian made me feel alone, and I distanced myself a bit. However, I distanced myself off from church, but I ultimately decided that I believed in God, and I decided that I believed in His plan of salvation and in the potential of religion to make us perceive God's love and unite each other spiritually. And I have had experiences like that in occasions that I prayed. I felt that I I something, not just someone, uh, that there was someone hearing me, listening to me, but also that I could perceive other people, perhaps praying for me, or perhaps I could perceive the love from other people, and that inspired me as well in my lowest moments. Um, did you want to add something?
Yeah, well, listening to your experience is very fascinating because I can see some similarities between our experiences, but I also see some differences. You mentioned the book of Revelation specifically, and I find that very interesting because I think that I didn't like the book of Revelation for many years
Mm-hmm.
because I think on some level, well, I would say conscious, but also unconscious level, because there's something really deep about it, what I'm about to say, but there was a frightening aspect to it. Despite the fact that I believed, just there are certain passages there that really disturbed me. And so I became more attracted to the gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And, for a while there, I was wondering, I was kind of questioning Revelation, whether, because I had interacted with so many people who are always talking about we are in the end times. I don't know if you've ever talked to someone who always makes reference to the end times, that we are close to the end.
Yes, I
And
did.
yeah. And I think it had a negative effect on me because I think I got tired of hearing the sort of we're all doomed kind of language, and it it made me not it made me dislike Revelation. Now, of course, I see it differently now. Now I understand Revelation as part of a larger context, but at the time, this is the effect it was having on me. And, eventually I just got so frustrated with people always talking about the end time all the time because I felt it was so arrogant, because what gives you the right to say that when it's time for things to come to an end?
Hmm.
Don't could you not say that there was someone 1,000 years ago who thought the world was about to end for whatever reason? Or how about when Hitler was in power? I'm sure there were some people then that were thinking, man, we might be at the end here. So what gives us the right to say that we are definitely like close to being done? That was the thing that frustrated me so much. And I basically well, and there it was a personal frustration, but then once I started looking deeper into the scripture advises us not to make predictions about the end, to not pretend to know when the end is coming. The Bible actually says that we shouldn't do that, that only God knows the time and that we should just be ready. And so I think that's how I kind of got out of that hole there. Is that I started listening more to God instead of listening to other people. And I think that's what trips us up is like when we start listening to other people, when we start listening to a religion, when we start listening to a pastor more than we listen to God, we get in trouble. Even if that pastor is saying good things, it can still get us in trouble because the pastor is not why we are here.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. We are here for God, is what you're saying. Like, we perhaps the pastor can help us understand it, but it's also his understanding of what he's reading. And the best thing we can do is to actually read the scriptures. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, the scriptures, that's one way of doing it. Praying,
Mm-hmm.
and not just praying. I think listening. I think one thing that people miss with their praying sometimes is that it's a one way deal. They want to ask God for everything, sort of like he's a Santa Claus or something. It's a one way deal. God, please forgive me. Please give me this. Please help this person over here. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't do that, but there also needs to be some listening. And I know that this, for some people, it's like, well, what are you talking about? I mean, you can't literally hear the voice of God, can you? Well, I think that after experiencing a number of things and you keep failing at it over and over and over again, you will hear a voice. At least I do. Now, some people just say it's their conscience, which that's fine if that's their belief. If they only believe that it's their conscience talking to them, that's fine. But I think that there's something else going on, and and I think that's an important part of this is listening. I think that there are certain things that I've done wrong that I recognized at the time, like, oh, I'm blanking on something right now, even though I've done many wrong things throughout my life. But there are some things that I've done wrong that I immediately recognized as wrong. Then there are other things that I didn't even recognize until years down the road. And why did I recognize that? In some cases, it wasn't even that I was thinking that much about it. It was almost like I was walking through life, I was fine, and then a revelation happened. And I attribute that revelation to me finally hearing God, so to speak. But it's a complicated topic because it's so personal. You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? Like, I can't tell you how to listen. I can't tell you how to talk to God. That's just something that we have to figure out on our own. So it's not like a scientific concept. If you're going to think about this rationally and from a scientific perspective, it won't make any sense.
Yeah, that's true. Because it's an abstract concept by itself, and you also have to kind of be open to to the idea that that you are going to listen to God's voice. And it also happened to me. I eventually felt that I got a response from a personal doubt that I had. In fact, I was actually going to become a missionary this year because of the revelation that I had, or like a personal revelation that I had, that I felt that we needed the gospel, like that the world needed the gospel for the people to start following perhaps some of what Jesus Christ said, some of what that we perhaps should love our neighbors more, etc. Do you understand what I'm getting at?
Oh yeah, absolutely, yes.
Yes, and that's also some sort of my experience with spirituality. I also so and so Jed, now I think you want to talk about Earthbound. So, but I want and that leads me to ask you, how do you feel that spirituality is explored within this medium of video games? Like you can start with Earthbound if you want.
Yeah, I might start with Earthbound. So because I do think it's the strongest, but actually now that I think about it, maybe we can maybe we can go in a little bit of a different direction. Maybe I can mention first a game that does make reference to spirituality. This idea of whether you're close to God, whether you have faith in this sort of thing,
Mm-hmm.
as sort of a contrasting point here. It's going to set up what I'm going to talk about with Earthbound. So this is a game that I believe that you tried out recently, if I remember correctly from one of our previous conversations. But the Shiva,
Okay.
uh, the point and click adventure game that is about a Jewish minister, and he has a congregation, but the congregation is very empty, and he finds himself wondering, well, what's the point of it? Almost. I mean, even if the game doesn't go as explicitly as you would like it to, perhaps you do get this feeling when you see this minister kind of talking to a mostly empty congregation. That's an intense feeling of loneliness, and so you would start, if you were in that situation, you would start to wonder, well, is my faith even worth anything? And I think that is the foot that this game starts on, is this question of, where this guy is at right now. You know, he doesn't have a bunch of people listening to him. He's not really ministering to a lot of people, and so that causes some questions, I think, to come into his mind. And then I think the game, he starts to find a little bit of a purpose, I think, through a murder mystery, because
Mm-hmm.
someone is murdered in the game, and then it's going to affect it affects him, directly. I believe he's framed, if I remember correctly, and so he decides to become a gumshoe of sorts, a detective of sorts, and basically solve the murder mystery. And so you go through the game and you have to collect clues and talk to people and all this sort of thing. And one thing I thought that was funny about this game is that whenever you have the opportunity to respond to a dialogue prompt, you can give different answers. And there was like this one answer that was like the religious type of answer.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was kind of amusing, the way that was done. It was actually pretty interesting because depending on what you selected, the dialogue would be different, from the main character. But I think the problem with the Shiva, despite the fact that I think it has a very compelling introduction and a compelling character, and 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 definitely I think it's worth exploring this idea of Jewish identity and the Jewish religion. Like that's something that hasn't really been explored at all in video games. So I give the Shiva a lot of credit for those things. But I do think that the game eventually just sort of loses spiritual focus, because there's a part at the end of the game where you end up at odds with this corrupt rabbi, and you actually get into a boxing match, with this rabbi. And it's, to me, the game gets so silly that it sort of distracts me from its better qualities. And I think ultimately it's just not as powerful because it gets wrapped up too much in the sort of crime fiction angle that is a part of its storyline. And that's just my opinion. So going back to Earthbound now, what I think makes Earthbound great is that the way that it ends is so much more powerful than anything else that I've ever played when it comes to a video game having spiritual significance. And I'm specifically talking about the climax of the game in the final boss
Mm-hmm.
battle.
Yes.
So I think for me to illustrate this point, it would be best if I tell you a little bit about my history with Earthbound,
Okay.
because as you know, we often play games multiple times, and they can kind of speak to us in different ways depending on which playthrough we're on.
Okay. Yes.
So in general, I have had an interest in role playing games since I think the age of 7 or 8. I came aboard with the original Final Fantasy on the Nintendo Entertainment System. Have you played the original Final
Yes,
Fantasy
I
by any
have.
chance? Okay, so you know as well as I do that it's a fine introduction if you don't know anything else about role playing games. If like you have really no recognition of what experience points are or something like that. At that point, up until that point, I'd only played platformers and shooting games and things of this nature. And then I
Mm-hmm.
played it. And this idea of gaining experience points through battle and becoming stronger through that just fascinated me. I could, and then the random encounters too. Like I was blown away by that because it was so different. I was blown away by the turn-based combat. I'd always been interested in chess before. I learned chess at an early age, and so here was a video game kind of doing its own version of turn-based stuff, and so it grabbed me. And so the reason I'm saying this is because I played so many role-playing games where the idea is to gain experience points and to eventually beat the greatest threats, through your experience, the experience points that you've
Mm-hmm.
gotten. And of course, you gain spells, you equip different armor after you buy them. Of course, you buy them by gaining gold, through fighting enemies too. So there's like this cycle of like fighting things and gaining experience points, gaining gold, and then using those things to get stronger. In the case of experience points, a lot of it is just automatic. Like your strength automatically goes up. Now, of course, some allow you to adjust it yourself. Of course, that didn't come later on. That came later on. Initially, it was just for the most part, and a lot of these, it was just you become stronger automatically. Well, I was playing Earthbound my first time with Earthbound. I think I was a teenager in my late teens maybe when I was playing Earthbound, and I was playing it like I would any other role playing game. I was grinding the appropriate amount so that I could get through enemies without too much difficulty. Although of course I failed many times because maybe I didn't grasp the systems of the game that well at first.
Mm-hmm.
But I got all the way to the end boss, and I was at a pretty high level when I got to the boss. I was in the 80s. I think I was like at 83 or 84, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you can actually beat Earthbound at a lower level than that for sure, because in a later playthrough, I would beat it at like maybe level 60 or something like that. So you don't have to be at 80, but I was pretty strong though, And so I get to the last boss, and I'm fighting it, and I'm pretty well prepared. I'm well stocked, and I feel like I'm powerful enough to defeat the boss, and I'm just wailing away at it. And I get to the point where the boss form starts to change, and then it gets to its final form, and it's almost like you're fighting like the abyss. Like it's like you can barely see the image of the boss anymore. It's like it's kind of distorted, and and so at this point it's an interesting metaphor because it's kind of describing what my intentions were. I'm just thinking about this game from a traditional role-playing standpoint. I should just keep whacking this thing until it dies, and that's the end of the game. That's what I was thinking at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I kept doing that, and of course I couldn't beat it. I could not beat it. It kept killing me. And I got back to it again, and I would do the same thing, just keep whacking at it, and it would. I could only survive for so long. It would just take my guys out one by one. Whether it be Ness, Paula, or Pooh, or Jeff, it would just take them out. And I could not figure out what was going on. And you know what I did? I actually put the game down because I wanted to play other games where I could actually make some
Mm-hmm.
progress, and that's what I've always done. I've always tried to play a lot of different things at one time. So I got away from it, and I didn't go back to it. Well, a couple of years later, my sister started playing Earthbound, and she was aware of my experience, my failure, and so she was convinced that she could make up for this, and so she started grinding in the game, and she got into the 90s. So she got even higher than I was. And I remember going over to her place, and she must have been, I don't know, she must have been 20, and I must have been, we must have both been in our 20s at this point.
Mm-hmm.
She said, I've been trying to beat this last section of the game, and I just can't do it. And I remember what happened to you, Jed, and I just think that you should try it now. Now, you can try these higher leveled characters, And so I get back to the last boss, and it starts happening again. I get to the last form, and he starts to get me. I can't quite. I can't remember which character he killed. One of the characters, and it was looking like it was going in the wrong direction again. Well, I'm kind of hopeless at this point in a way, because it's like, well, I couldn't beat him in my 80s, and now I'm using my sister's game, and these characters are in the 90s, and I still can't beat it. And then finally, I look at one of the commands, pray, by Paula. And what's interesting about this is that I had tried using the pray command before,
Mm-hmm.
in my first playthrough, but I never found it that effective. I was always thinking, well, I could just do another technique that would be more effective. So why should I ever pray? And so I kind of abandoned prayer in the game, so to speak, which is funny because I think I had done the same thing in my life at one point. I stopped praying as much. So I think that's kind of funny. So anyway, so yeah, I finally decided, well, I haven't tried anything else, and maybe this can do something, And so I prayed in the game, so to speak, and it did a little damage. And I thought, well, I guess I'm going to keep going with this. And so the next round, Paula gets her turn again. I pray again. And the more I do this, I notice the damage is going up. And then another thing starts to happen. And to me, it felt miraculous because, again, I'm going off of my previous experience. I died multiple times in this situation, just trying to play it like a regular RPG. And it was like a miracle for me with that background. I mean, it started going to cutscenes of people in different parts of Earthbound's world, and they were all coming together. They were all praying because they knew that the situation called for it. They knew that that was their only hope, that you can't beat this evil through your own power, that you need a higher power to get through this. Regardless of whether you live or not, you might die. The idea of calling upon the higher power, it gives you this sense that everything is going to be okay, that I could actually lose my physical life right now, but at least I'm going about this the right way. And so I was feeling this as I was seeing these cutscenes, and then of course with each prayer from Paula and these other characters, because with each cutscene it's more and more people gathering.
Mm-hmm.
I started noticing more and more damage, and then finally you get to that final damage, and it's just bam, it defeats it. And I was like, wow, literally is the God is the secret weapon in this game. And that just blew my mind because, again, I mean, I'm coming from a Final Fantasy background. I'm thinking about all these games: Final Fantasy, Secret of Mana, Secret of Evermore, Chrono Trigger, Super Mario RPG. I could go on and on and on. It's always about, how can you overcome it. Now there are some deviations, of course, but they don't involve God, though. Like Earthbound was the deviation that involved this idea of calling upon a higher power, and not just you doing it, but like the entire world in the game coming together and unifying against this sort of nihilistic, this this materialistic force that won't stop. And that's why I found Earthbound to be so spiritually profound.
Well, your experience with Earthbound, I feel that it matches mine to a certain extent. I have played the game Earthbound many times actually, um, and I also played the other games in the trilogy from author Shigesato Itoi. I played Earthbound Beginnings and Mother 3 many times as well, and it's something that he seems to have to actually believe in. Not necessarily. Well, it's more notorious in Earthbound, but in both in Urban Beginnings and in Motors 3, what happens is that the game subverts your traditional role playing solution, which is to grind, um, and well, you usually get accustomed to grinding and becoming more powerful by yourself and becoming stronger. But ultimately, it's not violence that leads you to to defeat the final menace of the game, but rather uh, being perhaps being compassionate or being or well praying in Urban's case. In Urban Beginnings, the first game, what happens is that you actually remind the final boss about his mother, about his connection to his mother. And in Mother 3, what you do is to try to forgive your brother for things that he has for things that he has done very badly through the game. And well, it's the idea of forgiveness and being peaceful. Is that in contrast to what the game had been uh, through the last, I don't know, 20 hours or something, that contrast that contrast becomes revelatory. And I feel that in Urban's case in particular, now that you're bringing this game up, I think that the the exploration of spiritual themes is perhaps more implicit throughout the whole game, because the objective that you do through the game is to try to connect yourself, your memories, your soul to the earth, to Mother Earth itself, to nature, and so that you can purify your mind. And once you have done that, and once you have connected your mind to to the earth, you get the possibility to get inside your own soul and to purify the evil of your heart. In the Japanese version, for example, when you get to magic and when you get it's more clear that this is it's not just the subconscious; it's the actual soul that Ness travels to, and the boss of that area, which is the statue, which is in the English version called Ness Nightmare, is explicitly called that it's the evil of his heart. It's called Ness Devil. Um,
That's powerful. That's powerful because there are scriptures that talk about how we cannot understand the evil in our own heart. That it is through God that we can understand the evil in our own heart. And so I'm glad you brought that up.
Yes, I think that they removed it because they had fear of American censorship back then. But I'm glad that they left the ending like it was. My experience with the Prey command was also similar to yours as well. By the way, I used it at the beginning once I got Paula, and I saw that it didn't do much, and I left it at the side. But eventually, once I got to the final battle, once I became I got to reach my ultimate power in the game. What happened to me is that the final boss was the final boss, which I associate it with the devil itself, because it's because this is an entity that influences other people to act evil through or to be mean to each other. Like it influences like humans appear as common enemies because of or animals appear as common enemies because of this uh, these entities influence. But also, some of the main antagonists are also influenced by him and corrupted by him because they are weakened by their own familiar situations. For example, for example, next neighbor, and he is directly influenced by his family situation, which was pretty bad, and and well, the thing is that I got to the final boss, and he was also defeating me. But once I He was also defeating me, and I ran out of revival items. I ran out of healing items. I think I also ran out of uh, of psychokinetic powers in that game, well,
Hmm.
the equivalent of magic. And thus, the only thing that remained me to do so that I could keep my party healed is to pray, and I used the pray command at the last moment, like as my last hope to try to win. And well, it happened that that was the solution. And to me that was the experience that I got from that is that we perhaps pray at from the bottom of our hearts the most when we are at our lows, when we see that there is no hope left, and that's something that I internalized back when I was a child and played it. And also my sister, when my sister played it years later, she also experienced that, and that was also a revelatory uh, aspect of the game that actually got her baptized. Like after, like that was one of her main influences to to that that helped to her own faith, to her own spiritual
Wow.
growth. Yes, like
Wow. That's incredible.
yes, it's incredible. Like that's what she told me, and well, it also influenced me. Also influenced me a lot, um, because it's also something that because at the end of because the game, after seeing everyone pray, the game actually demands you to pray as too. Demands you to pray with the rest of the game.
Right.
Yes,
Right.
by like it demands you with your own name, and the game makes an explicit, at least in the Japanese version, the game makes an explicit reference that you are praying to God, because Paula, this was cut in the American localization, but in the Japanese version, Paula uh, calls out for God if he actually like she says, if you are actually there, please listen to us, and because I assume that at her lowest at their lowest moment they might get desperate to perhaps even doubt and that's their last resort to get to pray at that moment. And well, it is also, since it's an experience that we also share with the characters, perhaps we share the idea that this is the most desperate moment that we have in this game, and the game demands us to pray with the other characters, and that was what made the experience to me powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. And and a really good point there. Your reference to the Japanese version, because one thing, and also it goes back to your point too that you made earlier about how there is a spiritual thread going through the entire game. And I would argue on many levels. I mean, you have the level that you mentioned earlier about how Ness is becoming more in tune with these like atavistic moments in his life. Like you get the sense that he actually becomes aware of what it was like to be a baby,
Mm-hmm.
at different points, which is a bizarre concept, but I found it quite fascinating. But then on another level, another thread that's going through is that from the beginning, you get the sense that Paula is a person of faith, and so to your point with the Japanese version, yes, that is a very effective way of showing how even someone of great faith will have a moment where they're going, okay, God, if you really are there,
Yes.
emphasis on the if, I mean, it reminds me of Christ, honestly. When you think about the crucifixion, there was that moment where he said, my God, and of course this is different because, we're talking about a direct father-son
Mm-hmm.
relationship. Uh, Saying, why have you forsaken me? And what's so profound about that statement is that if you believe that Christ is, God, if he is the Son of God, then why would he ask that question? If he really is so powerful, and it's an illustration of the human side of Christ,
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
and that's something that we have to come to grips with, is that yes, we might have faith, but that doesn't mean that it's going to be easy. In fact, the Bible suggests that life is not easy at all. That in fact we grow stronger through struggles, and some of these struggles involve God, um, doubting God. I mean, that is part of life, even for a believer. And so I take your point very well there. You know, um, Also going back to this point about the spiritual threads, going through the entirety of Earthbound. I've been replaying it.
Mm-hmm.
I started another game earlier this year, and then I put it down. I think it was around the summer, and I recently picked it back up. When you asked me to do this podcast, I decided to start playing it again,
Mm-hmm.
to pick up where I left off. And I got to a really interesting point of the game that I don't even know why I forgot about it, but it's also spiritually powerful. I would say it's maybe the second most spiritually powerful part in the game, in my opinion. And that is when you first take control of Prince Pooh.
Oh, right.
And yeah, so he has to do his training. And obviously this training is not, it's not like Rocky or the Karate Kid or any sort of thing like that where you're punching things and running and this sort of thing. It's a very spiritual type of training because it involves meditation.
Mm-hmm.
And so you take Pooh, and your master tells you that you have to go to the summit and start your training through meditation. And so you take the character and you go up to the summit, and Pooh starts to meditate. Well, as you know, a person enters the picture from another cliff, and this character, is a messenger, and the messenger is telling you, "Hey, the master wants you to come back now. You need to just stop doing what you're doing and go back to your master." I'm paraphrasing, of course.
Mm-hmm.
So then you press the control pad, and this is what I did anyway. I walked all the way back to my master.
I did that too.
And he says, "Okay, now it's time to go back to the summit," basically, is what he says. And so I did. I turned myself around and walked my butt back up to that summit. Well, start the process again. I felt like it was going to be a difference now. Well, the messenger comes back and says the same thing again. "Hey, your master is calling you. It's time to stop doing what you're doing, and you need to go on back." Well, guess what? I did it a second time. It had been so long since I played this game, I had forgotten about this. And I think one reason I forgot about it, to be honest with you, Ronaldo, is that I'm a Christian. That's why I forgot about it, because meditation, although I'm not saying Christians don't meditate, I'm saying that meditation is not something that I personally do, or that I feel like I'm specifically instructed to do as a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And
Understandable.
so I'm thinking that if I were a part of another religion that emphasized meditation, that maybe I wouldn't have forgotten the mechanical trick here, because I did. And so I walked back to the master, and then it hit me finally. I was like, "Okay, all right, dummy, you're not supposed to do this. You're supposed to go back up to the summit, and then when that person comes and talks to you again, you get the dialogue out, and then you don't press anything. just stay right there." Well, that's a really powerful thing. I mean, that struck me a lot more this last time, despite the fact that I am a Christian, and again, this doesn't speak to my religious experience. I think there is something to be said about this, and this goes back to what we were talking about earlier about escapism, about distraction.
Exactly.
I think Earthbound is specifically talking about this idea of being distracted. And this distraction takes you away from your spiritual purpose. That's what it was doing to Pooh. Pooh would never get through his training if he kept going back to the master and kept listening to this person. This you know, and it wasn't even an evil person either. They were just, I guess they were just doing what they were told to do, and that was it. So that just shows you that it doesn't have to be an evil thing, like an obviously evil thing to distract you. It can be something that's seemingly benign, seemingly helpful, but it's actually getting you off the path. And yeah, I think that that's a very interesting message there, that this is something that should be talked about more, I think, because Earthbound is not just sending us a message through dialogue. Obviously it uses dialogue to deliver part of the message, but it's using mechanics here in both cases.
Yes. I always got the impression that the lady that comes to tell you that you should go back to your master was sent by the master himself, because he wants you to learn how to focus what your spiritual growth, your meditation, and well, well, the experience of meditating is actually something that I tend to do. Like
Mm-hmm.
when I try to pray or reflect or read the scriptures or just think, I try to uh, look for a place where I'm alone. Like for sometimes I just shut out the room, but also I before the pandemic at least I used to go to a place where I could that was quiet so that I don't distract myself from the noise of the urban city. Speaking of which, the game makes a contrast between the. It's interesting that this takes place in a contemporary world. Like all of this takes place in a contemporary world because it says that. At least in my perspective, that Itoi, the writer, is commenting on um, is commenting on our world, like the modern world, modern society. Do you,
Right, right. And I think that gives it more urgency.
and now that you mentioned the word urgency, Itoi also explores those themes in Mother 3, which is the game that he made after that. And in Mother 3, what happens is that the abandonment of spiritual values is what brings destruction to the world and destruction to the families. Uh, and well, that game is an allegory. Like that game is like an apocalyptic allegory to what could happen to the world if we abandon our values, our spiritual values, and and that shows and that shows me that at least this author was very concerned about these topics, and to anyone that may have played Mother 3 before the other two, it gives it recontextualizes the meaning of those of the previous games, uh, if one wasn't aware of them.
Yeah, well, I've definitely been aware of those other two games, and I just haven't played them specifically. With Mother 3, which is something I've always been interested in. I've just been waiting on an official, North American release,
Yeah, it's a
and
pity.
yeah, and unfortunately, that I don't know if it will ever happen, and it's disappointing to say the least. I mean, obviously, people like you have played it and experienced it, and maybe I will get around to it at some point. See, now we're getting around the kind of thorny bush of emulation and translation and all this sort of thing. And it's just a shame to me. I'm kind of getting off topic a little bit, but I think it's important to bring up here. But it's just a shame to me that this industry, and I'm not just talking about the game companies, although obviously they're guilty, but the critics out there, the press, and not all of them. I'm not obviously there are some that specialize in preserving history and talking about history, but I'm just saying, like, from a mainstream angle, there needs to be more thought and more action about how can we get video game history in a form that we can continue to experience and even experience for the first time. I want to experience Mother 3 with a good translation, with an official release. And this shouldn't it shouldn't be like pulling teeth or anything like that. This should be a pretty simple idea because we know that Earthbound is a very popular game. It didn't start off that way, but it has grown in popularity over the years. And that's the thing. Like, there's a business case for it, and it's still not good enough for them. I don't pretend to know all of the background details about why this hasn't happened because people that read me know I try not to get too bogged down in background details because I feel like it can influence my opinion in a way
Hmm.
that is not true to my experience of actually like playing the game. But in this case, I haven't even played the game, and it's just I just wanted to just voice my disappointment in that. I just wish that this very simple idea of bringing Mother 3, officially to other parts of the world, it should happen. and there should be some movement, a bigger movement. Let me just put it that way about it.
Yeah, because there's certainly a movement or a lot of people demanding that that game is brought to the West, and unfortunately it isn't. I think it's either because of copyright or because the game didn't do that well in Japan because audiences thought it was too dark. And that's also the general reaction that people have with Mother 3, that it's too sad. But the idea is not that the game is sad. The idea is that this is an author that is making his a particular statement about what he thinks of modern society, and 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 that's why he hasn't made a game after that, because he has said everything that he feels he needed to say. He and well that's sort of that's also kind of happens with Earthbound. People see Earthbound as a funny game, or like as a funny game, or as a generic RPG, but it isn't that way. I feel that people kind of attempt to divide the 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 religious context of the or religious themes of the game from the game itself. Well, I think you have something to say about that, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a product of how secular criticism is in general now, and also just society. It's like we don't want to think about things that we can't just, you know, easily see in front of us. Now everyone wants something to be absolutely clear, like right in front of them. They want it to be convenient. They probably want it to be scientifically backed and all this other stuff. And Earthbound is not about that. Earthbound is definitely about spiritual themes. And yeah, when it was re-released recently in a couple of different forms, you had the virtual console, I believe, on the Wii U was
Mm-hmm.
maybe the first re-release,
Yes.
and then of course it came to 3DS, which by the way, that's the version that I've been playing is the new 3DS version.
Mm-hmm.
But but yeah, I read a lot of reviews of it when it came when it was re-released, with the Wii U, and people, I mean, most people didn't even mention the spiritual aspects of the game. Now, in one respect, that's not surprising because reviewers and critics, they don't always necessarily go that deep into what games are saying anyway. And I'm talking about games that have very heavy storytelling. They will make references to like character moments or something like that. But a lot of times and then maybe they'll say they think it's well written or it's scary or whatever, but they don't really get into like the actual meaning. And if they do, a lot of times will be like a 1 or 2 sentence deal. So in that respect, it's not surprising, but in another respect, it just kind of reflects like how secular everything is. I'm not saying that they are ardently opposed to spiritual concepts, because if they were, there's no way that they could play through Earthbound and be okay with it. Like if you were completely shut out, if you hated the very mention of a spiritual concept, you would not be able to play Earthbound. I mean, you wouldn't be able to go through the whole thing and feel good about it, because it brings it to the forefront in the ways that we've been talking about. Um, but it's just a simple, like you said, it's a simple evasion, or just not giving it the credit that it deserves, because that is what makes it. That's one of the things that makes it a unique game, is its spiritual power. And speaking of this idea of just looking at Earthbound as a quirky, funny game, which I do, which by the way I do think it's hilarious. I mean,
Yeah, I also
I've
do.
laughed. I mean, to this day, I'm on. I don't know how many times I've played through the game, but I still find it very funny, like frequently. Um, but there's a lot more going on, and so I look at something like Undertale, which is obviously very inspired by Earthbound, as well as other games. It has other influences, but I think Earthbound is,
The main one.
in a toys games in general. I think are very influential on Undertale. But Undertale, to me, misinterprets these games, specifically Earthbound. There's a point in Undertale where instead of killing a particular enemy, you can actually get to the pray command. Well, when you do the pray command in Undertale, it means nothing. It means absolutely nothing. All it means is that you got to the command that you needed to do. Like, because that same command in a different battle would just be flirt. You just flirt with an enemy and then the fight stops. Or in another one, you like compliment them or something. In this context, pray is just like complimenting someone. So it has no spiritual meaning whatsoever. And Undertale, again, I think is just quirky for the sake of being quirky. It says nothing about humanity. It's completely wrapped up into this sort of like metatextual analysis that is quite frankly amateurish. Any amateur game critic can make the observations about game design that Undertale makes. So it's a pointless game, and again, yeah, it represents this idea of avoiding what's clearly there. It's just another example of a game that really it even takes the prayer concept, but it completely misses the point.
Well, if I remember correctly, because I actually saw Undertale again. Not I didn't play it, but I saw Undertale again. And if I remember correctly, the game doesn't even call it pray. Like it's obviously the a reference to Urban's prayer, but it doesn't even call it pray. It just says act, which is weird.
Yeah, maybe, and we might be talking about a translational difference or something like that. I seem to remember praise specifically being in there, but maybe it was something that just, basically like a proxy for it. But to your point, if that is the case, I mean that really does drive the point home. But see, I don't want to just, I don't necessarily want to spend this time bashing Undertale, although I mean, I think it should be bashed for sure because it's
I
one of the
do.
most overrated. It's one of the most overrated games of all time. I mean, it should be bashed, but you know, well, I mean, let's think about some other games here. Like you don't want to ever play a game and think that it's saying something that it's not. And I've read some commentators talk about spiritual themes in games, and they'll even bring up Zelda, for example, and they'll bring up how the Triforce is making some metaphorical reference to the Holy Trinity, in Christianity or something like that. And of course, there are like religious, I guess, religious references in it. You go into uh, there are different points in different Zelda games where it's like, okay, this is like a religious atmosphere, but what's the point of Zelda when you play it? I mean, you don't get any spiritual insight from playing Zelda. In fact, even when I'm in those areas of those Zelda games where the atmosphere is supposed to be more religious or whatever, like it doesn't make me feel anything like I feel whenever I go to a good church service or, when I'm reading a scripture that inspires me, or hell, when I just, run into someone who I've never talked to before and I just get to share my life with them. And then the topic of spirituality comes up. Zelda never makes me go in that direction at all, even though it has elements that you could say arguably make it quote spiritual. It's a superficial thing, and so I think there's a lot of that going on too. Is that maybe there are times when developers they want to put spiritual concepts into games, but they just it's sort of like lip service. You just here's a reference, and yeah, so now we have some spiritual concept here, but it really doesn't have much meaning because again, it's not really teaching you anything. I feel like Earthbound is an edifying game, and going back to your sister as an example, I mean that's an extreme example, but that is evidence that it can be very edifying.
Yes, it was very edifying for her, and I also wanted to comment a bit about what you just said, that religion is usually used as a lip service. I generally see that mainly in mainstream video games and or even in other JRPGs that they use, like in many JRPGs the final enemy is usually God, for example, or a
Right.
god, and they and and I generally get the impression that at, at that it's lip service, or even at worst it could be insulting, and not just for because okay, they use a god figure to, and they criticize it. I don't mean it like that, but rather that they appropriate imagery, and perhaps they appropriate imagery, and they just to look cool, like just that the game looks cool, like they appropriate. For example, I talk about JRPGs, but also I think if I remember correctly, in Bioshock Infinite there was a scene with a baptism, and that doesn't mean anything in that game. In fact, the game, the game is doesn't dare to take meaningful meaningful position about anything, and and I feel that that a lot of games use religious symbolism just to look cool, so just that they can look profound, and and that but and that bothers me to a certain extent, because I feel that what the games do is to fit this mentality of superficial appreciation of spiritual elements in games. I don't know if you perceive it that way.
Yeah, I think there's some truth to what you're saying, and you know what I call it? I call it spiritual tokenism. Because you take that idea of tokenism. What are we talking about here? We're talking about when a game wants you to think that it is pro diversity. Like we're not just making a game for white people with white heroes. Here's a black character, or here's a Latino character, and so now we're diverse. Well, that's tokenization right there.
Mm-hmm.
That's the main term. Well, I'm just borrowing that idea and applying it here. I see it as spiritual tokenization for sure, and it's something that doesn't get talked about a lot because I just don't think critics, to a large extent, care that much about spiritual matters, at least in their writing. I don't see that. Or maybe, and I understand that sometimes, maybe they're thinking, well, I might drive readers away, or maybe they're just not spiritual people. Like I don't ever want to come across as to say, hey, you need to be exactly like me.
Mm-hmm.
Like I understand some people aren't spiritual. I understand people have, in their minds, very good reasons not to be spiritual. If you were raised in a church like me, but you're, I don't know, some sort of affair happened that had some kind of impact on your family, you see that hypocrisy, and you feel the pain of it, like in that deep sort of way. I could understand why you may swear off church and religion and God and all of it. Because to go back to your earlier point, you were talking about this idea of having doubt, because why would God allow something bad to happen? Well,
Mm-hmm.
if you take that to its logical extreme, you would basically just say, well, it looks like bad things are going to happen no matter what. So why should I even believe in God? There just really doesn't seem to be a point. So even though I understand where people are coming from. So I don't want to say that, a writer has to be exactly like me. And at the same time, when we talk about this as an issue with the spiritual kind of lip service or whatever, I'm not saying that artists should bend to my will either. Like, that's one thing that I don't think people always get from my criticism, is that they see the harshness of it, or they see the bluntness of it, and they think that I believe that artists should just do whatever I think is right. And I don't believe that. I just criticize what's in front of me. That's how I look at it every last time. I don't write criticism, and I don't criticize games with the idea that this will make the world better, that this will make the industry better, that some developer will read my critique and go, "Oh, wow, I've been doing it wrong the whole time." I find that kind. I mean, I'm not saying that you're wrong if you do take that approach, but me personally, I find it a bit arrogant to assume that I can just change an industry, that I should just drive artistic thought and that sort of thing. I don't believe that. I think artists should do whatever they want to, but as long as they're going to continue to just do, again, this sort of superficial reference to spirituality, I'm going to call it out. It's within my right to do so. Now, it's interesting, one thing you referred to earlier, which I think is a very relevant thing, is this idea of fighting God in these some of these video games, where the God or God is the main enemy. And it reminds me of something that came out earlier this year, an independent game called Alder's Blood.
I haven't played
And
it.
yeah, well, it's a very interesting game for a lot of reasons. One reason is that it is a tactics game, a turn-based tactics game, and it does some interesting things with that formula that's a bit unusual. But I think thematically, though, what makes it interesting is that it involves a world where God is literally dead. Like, this is not just the idea of rejecting God as an atheist or something like that. This game is implying that God was literally killed because humankind just had no more use for him. So it goes back to that JRPG fantasy that you referred to, this idea of like overcoming God, finally putting God in his place, so to speak. Again, I consider it a sacrilegious concept, but I'm taking it for what it is as a story idea. So in Alder's Blood, this has already happened. In other words, that final boss battle that we are talking about, like that's already happened in this game,
Hmm.
basically, because God is dead. And so through God's death comes greater evil. This just darkness, and these monsters are basically just they're just coming out of the woodwork, and it's because of God's corpse. And so what I find interesting about this game is that I'm not saying this game would have an impact on someone like Earthbound or even the Shiva for that matter. I'm not saying it's going to like make you maybe contemplate spirituality to that extent, but there is an implication to it in that, okay, so yeah, humans decided that they had had enough and they don't need God. Well, then they kill God, and then through killing God, the world just becomes extremely bleak. I mean, if you ever play Alder's Blood, you'll see one of the bleakest worlds in video games. And so I do think that's interesting that it uses that JRPG concept of killing God, but it kind of shows you, well, it's not necessarily going to be happy when you do it.
I understand. I haven't played the game, so maybe I will check it out later. Um,
Yeah.
but the main thing that I was thinking of when I was talking about the RPGs is the Shin Megami Tensei franchise, for example. I don't know if you have played any of the games.
Say that again. I'm sorry.
Shin Megami Tensei.
Oh, trying to remember here. Yes, I've played. Okay, it was a negative experience. If I'm remembering correctly, it was the fourth one.
Yes,
What wasn't the fourth one on the? Was it the
it
DS?
was on the 3DS.
Okay. Um, yeah, I played the fourth one briefly, and I didn't get deep into it, and I'll tell you why. The reason I didn't go too deep into it is because the tutorialization was so extreme that I got fed up with it. I said, I'm not playing this crap anymore. I want to play a game. I don't want to play a tutorial. So having said that, I'm not trying to take anything away. I wanted to just throw that in there. But yeah, please go on, because I want to hear your perspective, because you definitely know more about this series than I do.
Okay. No, just to add to what you just said, I think that you wouldn't stand Atlas games in general, or at least modern Atlas games in general. Okay, so now that we're on this, the thing is that in the Shin Megami Tensei franchise, the idea is that every of the is that the monsters that you come across are, for example, deities from any religion, and they exist there because someone believes in them. But the at least in the more modern games, the trend that I notice is that they put the Abrahamic God as the final enemy, as the final menace, and 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 I noticed that at least in the modern games, not so much in the oldest ones, but in the most more modern games, I noticed that they do it to fulfill a power fantasy, the power fantasy of defeating the Abrahamic God, because that's the religion that is the most extended in the world, and 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 I feel that at least these notions feed perhaps an equivocal uh, or perhaps immature idea of rebelling authority, which I don't think is healthy, and I take more issue with that because it's directly using uh, iconography from other religions to make the player feel cool, and I take particular issue with that. Now, as for the original games, for example, in the original games, the idea was to make the play to follow the player's actions through the game and let them uh, and let them join a faction, the either the church or or people who rebel against the church, according to your own actions, and they could vary they could vary a lot. And in the original games, the end result is that any of the two factions that you could have chosen, um, they like if you take any of the extremes, like if you take the extreme of following what the church says, just like they say, or if you reject completely, uh, or if you reject or if you reject a religion completely, both of them lead to a rather dystopian world, and and the most not the best necessarily, but the solution that the game seems to support is to not to lead to not to lead to any not to lean on any of those two extremes, and well, and that was meaningful back then because the idea of the game was that there was a possibility that us leading to extreme ideologies could separate us, and that's what brings conflict, and but now none of that is present. Like none of them is present in the French because the the original creators left. But nevertheless, that's what the franchise as a whole. That's what happens with the franchise.
Yeah, and that's a very interesting telling of what that franchise did, and then what it became. And I couldn't help but think of a game that came out very recently that sounds familiar based on your description of the originals in that series. And I'm thinking specifically, and if I remember correctly, I don't think you're too fond of this particular game, but I was Fire Emblem Three Houses
Okay.
because I felt that it was sort of doing a similar thing where, of course, you know, um, the faction that you might end up choosing in Three Houses might just be based on, hey, I like this character design, initially or something like that. But ultimately, as you know, depending on what faction you choose in Three Houses, you might end up on the side of the church, or you might end up on the side of a very militant atheistic movement,
Mm-hmm.
and I found that I found it an interesting presentation of conflict. I mean, it didn't necessarily. I mean, obviously, it was different from what you described because I don't think it really has like this sort of middle ground solution, so to speak. I think mainly what Three Houses is doing is just kind of showing you extreme ideology, just how how violent politics is influenced by not only religion but by by potentially atheism. So that's why I thought it was interesting, but I couldn't help but think of it when you were talking about that series.
Yes, the things with Shin Megami Tensei is that, or at least the difference with Three Houses, that in Three Houses you choose your path at the beginning, and in Shin Megami Tensei the path gets established at near the end of the game once you have done everything, and you don't really know what's going to happen. You just act according to to perhaps to your own standards. I remember that the first time I played that game, I ended up in the low path, like in low. I don't know how it's pronounced in English, like the church side, at the church side.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, because that's because I did everything that I was thought of, but I did everything that I thought it was correct, and I ended in the church. But and at the end, what happens is that the church path makes the church path thinks that, or at least the church path in this game thinks that uh, they are close, that they are the closest to God, but they're also self righteous and reject people who don't follow the orders, and and that's some, and well, that's a common trend in a lot of video games, but what surprised me is that my own thoughts led me to that, or led me to that conclusion. And it wasn't until I knew that there was a neutral, well, not a neutral, a middle ground path, that I realized that the other possibility. And even the middle ground path isn't necessarily the best one, because the world is still in shambles, because there is no certain path in that game at the end. But you just know that it's the path that may probably allow people to realize more about themselves, because uh, they are going to reach perhaps the growth that they were expected from the church, but by themselves, not by the will of the church, or they aren't going to completely reject that. And that's what resonated. That's what resonated with me about that game in particular.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point that you make there, because you're drawing direct attention to this idea that we were kind of talking about earlier about spirituality versus religion. Because again, if you ever get to the point where you're listening to a church or listening to a pastor, or listening to whomever, uh, if you do that too much, that's not spirituality. And so yeah, I take your point there. That's a really interesting dynamic there that game has going on. And yeah, it would be interesting for sure to see more games in the future. Not tread the same ground, but try to go a little bit deeper into some of these things. And and I don't know you know, like I said, I don't know the path forward, because I don't want to tell artists what to do or anything. It would just have to be something that comes naturally from someone. We were talking about the creator of the Mother series. Why is he such a great artist? I mean, I think he's one of the greatest artists in the video game medium.
Yeah,
But
I
the reason
think so.
why he's a yeah, and the reason why is because he's acting on his convictions. So I don't know. I guess we'll just have to wait and see. Is really kind of the approach to take, because like I said, I've never had the goal of you know influencing someone to do a certain thing the way that I would do it. Now, I will say, as a Christian, I do try to show people. I try to make the argument that my spiritual path is the ultimately the right one. uh, I will make that argument, and I will try to back that up with, whether it be scripture or my own actions or my own life experiences. But at the same time, even though I will do that, I don't believe in forcing beliefs on someone, because that misses the entire point. Spirituality is not about an external force making someone do something. It is about that person coming to a place in their life where they're saying, you know what, maybe there is something more to this than just the world. Maybe there is something beyond that.
Hmm.
And I think everyone should have the respect to be able to get to that point themselves. This idea of forcing people to do things, and slamming the Bible on their forehead and that sort of thing, that's definitely the wrong approach.
Yeah, I don't ever do that. And well, I have a lot of friends who aren't Christian. They are atheists because of many circumstances of their lives. For example, they're
Hmm.
LGBT, or they have been, or they belong to a church that has completely obligated them to do certain things, etc. But I don't tend to put ideas on their head, because I know it's not something should that that is right for me to do. It's like, if they ever decide to come closer to Christ, it must be because they have this personal realization by themselves, and that's part of what ultimately uh, is uh, is part of is also what is essentially needed to accept accept, for example, Christianity in your life. For example, in the Bible, the people that came to John the Baptist, they came by their own will. They came to get baptized to get cleansed from their sins, and that's something big. And they do that because they reached repentance, and that's something that is important when people uh, try to become try try to that's important so that people reach that point in their life when they have to accept perhaps spirituality as a whole, not just Christianity, but perhaps the notion that there's something more than the world.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned John the Baptist specifically, because that gets me thinking back to the gospel in general. And there's many passages. There's more than one passage in there that talks about how Christ is coming to heal those who are in need or who are sick. He's not here to save those who see themselves as healthy or as having a good beat on things, so to speak. And so, with that sort of with those passages in mind, that's what informs my approach to this. Is
Mm-hmm.
that yes, I can share my faith, I can try to show my faith, I can explain why I believe what I believe, but ultimately, someone who doesn't feel like they are in need, they're not going to accept it. And so, to go back to your point that you just made, it really is about a personal decision, a personal relationship, and that is something that is sacred. And unfortunately, a lot of Christians have defiled that. In other words, they don't recognize that sacredness there, that sacredness of the personal decision of free will that I believe God gives us for a reason. God does not want robots.
Yeah, I also I also avoid that. But even then, my friends, even the friends that are atheists, because of those circumstances I described, they come to me to ask me things about religion because and I answer them because I feel that it may help them. Like I think that in a sense it's part of everyone's responsibility, at least from those ones that belong to Christianity, to help other people to come to Christ. And well, that's why I think it's important to let them find their path, but you can be there uh, to to help them make things clear, but they have to find their path. That's what I think about it.
Yeah. So I think that I think we've gotten to a really interesting point of the conversation here because, I mean, at the very least, so far, I think that we have shown how something again that humankind has been grappling with for thousands of years, how something like that can have a place in video games, and how something like the series that you were talking about just a few moments ago, or of course Earthbound, or maybe even the Shiva, how these games can get us to start thinking about these sorts of matters in a more philosophical way and also in an emotional way, because I think that emotion itself is a very important part of spirituality. You have to feel it ultimately, and I think that's why I keep coming back to Earthbound. I think is because it does have that philosophical component to it. Ultimately, you do need to pray when you're at your lowest. You do need to rely on a higher power, but I think that also the emotion that I feel when I'm playing that particular part of the game, it just rings true to me. And that's what art is all about, I think. The best art, I would say, is it makes us feel something on a very deep level, and it helps us understand ourselves and the world. And yeah, that sounds corny, I know. It definitely sounds corny, but it's important. The older I get, the more I realize that some of the things that people just outright dismiss as corny or overly sentimental or something like that. Yeah, you can lay the syrup on too thick, so to speak, and I don't want to do that. but I also don't want to overlook the fact that life is serious. Life is very difficult, and it makes sense that these art forms would express that. And so again, I guess I get back to the point that I made not too long ago, that what will video games have to offer us in this respect from a spiritual angle? I don't know. We just have to wait and see. We have to wait and see how the world is going to continue to influence artists and audiences. And I think that this year, 2020 in particular, with the pandemic, and here in the United States, it's just been pandemonium. All year. Yeah. I mean, it's just. I mean, it's very interesting thinking about it. I mean, I know you don't live here, and so I would imagine that someone like you, or someone from another country, you can see it too. You can see the pandemonium, and I think that these sorts of problems, even though they are really bad, and we are in a dire situation for sure, I think that it can inspire us to start looking deeper into our lives, and so that might have an impact on different art forms going forward. But then you get into the whole business side of art too, and as we know, that's something that has a huge influence on video game production. And yeah, it's I think that if you were to ask me what's going to determine, or heavily determine, like how spiritual games get, I think unfortunately commercial interests might be the major driving force. It's going to be whether a producer feels okay with such themes being put out there. They're going to be thinking about, well, is this marketable? You know, will this turn people off, and that sort of thing. And this kind of ties back to what I was talking about earlier. You were asking me my spiritual experience and things like that. I think my spiritual experience was was impacted by the sheer amount of attention that I was giving the video game medium. As a critic, I was trying to stay on top of everything.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember certain years like 2017, 2018, those years in particular, I can't even tell you how many games that I played that came out for those respective years.
Mm-hmm.
Because what I was trying to do is I was trying to keep up with everything that was coming out so that I could speak with some knowledge about these things whenever I'm writing my articles or making different comparisons or end of year lists and all this sort of thing. And I think that I was, not only in playing all these games and spending so much time with them, um, not only was I making it more difficult for myself from a physical, because you can lose sleep when you focus so much on video games.
That's true.
Also, the older you get, I'm now about to turn 36. I'm realizing that, hey, actually, like playing with a controller for hours at a time, it gets more exhausting than it did when I was a teenager or in my 20s. I mean, I can't, honestly, I just don't have the same amount of energy as I used to. And so it was having a physical impact on me. And of course, that's going to have a mental impact on someone. But then I really started looking deeper, and the spiritual impact was what was most troubling. Ultimately, it doesn't matter whether I'm tired or whether mentally I'm shot. What matters the most is where I stand spiritually. And I think that this sort of need to stay on top of the video game medium, because games ask for so much of your time. I mean, compared to other art forms. When you think about movies, you can watch a movie in a couple of hours, even though I think a lot of movies are overlong now. Now they're for 2 hours constantly, blockbusters. You're still not, spending your entire day with a movie. Even a long novel, I've never spent 80 hours reading a novel. Like, it's just never happened. I mean, it just hasn't happened. So video games ask for a lot of your time. I guess like the thing that maybe is comparable to that is maybe a television series. But even then, though, like the traditional television model where you have a new episode coming out every week, you're not really like spending a ton of time at one time. But now it's starting to change. Now you're seeing television series the entire season's coming out all at once,
in
and so that
Netflix.
inspires people to binge. And so I can see a comparison as far as like the way it sucks up your time. I can see a comparison between a single video game and like a single television series. But I still think that video games, um, they ask for so much of our time, and so we need to really question why we're giving our time to them. I think, and just to say, well, I enjoy it. I mean, that's such an obvious thing. I mean, that's one thing that I wish we could get away from, not just from a spiritual angle, but just in general. This whole idea of, well, this game was good because I enjoyed it. I mean, come on, man. Enjoyment is assumed. Why would you spend your entire life doing something that's extracurricular unless you enjoyed it? I wish we would stop fixating on these mindless concepts that should just be assumptions that, yes, you do enjoy video games. You play them, don't you? I mean, obviously you enjoy them. Let's talk about something deeper than that. And so that's where I am.
I understand your sentiment about games that are as long as television series, because I generally don't like games that are that long, because they consume a lot of my time. I think the last time that I felt like that, like I felt really bad about playing a game, was when I was with Persona 5. Uh, do you know? Because that game is super long. It's like 100 hours, and and people saw me sad because I finished it. Because they saw me sad because I finished it, and I didn't like the game, and that made me wonder, why did I spend so much time with that? Like, that's the thing.
Right.
Why do we spend? Why do games have to get as long as they are? Like, as long as those. Like, and they perhaps distract us from other activities that are more important for our personal growth. So,
Right.
did you want to add something?
Oh no, all I was gonna say was that I think your question, why do games have to be so long, is very valid, especially in the case of Persona 5, where it's such a poorly edited game. You seriously, that game could be just a few, like maybe, I don't know, you could make a 36-hour game out of that, and I think it would lose none of its power. I mean, not saying it's a great game anyway, but I don't think there was any reason for it to be that long. Then the next question is, after you say, well, why do games have to be so long? The next question then is, why do we spend so much time with them? And I know you were referring to that too. Talking about your experience with Persona 5, kind of like wondering, you spend 100 hours with it. Why did I do this? Um, there is an ideology that I know you're very aware of, where, hey, you can't talk about a game with any knowledge or authority unless you've, you quote, beaten it. And I think that's what is driving a lot of the time into these things, is that people have it in their minds that if they don't beat the game or whatever, that they're somehow unworthy. This is a lie. This is a lie that the industry is propagating, and they want you to believe that. Why do they want you to believe that? They want you to think that you're getting your money's worth by spending 100 hours on Persona 5. That way, they can set you up for the next Persona game, Persona 6, and then maybe it would be 200 hours long. And, that's the thing. It's just, um, I think part of this, like from a spiritual angle, and also, I mean, even if you take spirituality out of it, even if you're just looking at your own mental well-being and your own physical well-being, and just the idea of having some diversity in your life, we need to stop buying into this notion that you have to beat games all the time, because it's just unnecessary. I played Persona 5 for 70 hours, and then I stopped. I was close to the end of it, but I was like, I don't need to see any more of this crap.
You, you,
I already know what I've guessed everything that it's doing. I mean, it keeps showing me the same cutscenes over and over again. I mean, it's just it didn't do anything really in 70 hours, hardly. I mean, there were like maybe two or three. I think the strongest part of the game was maybe the dungeons. A couple of the dungeons were interesting, but yeah, that day-to-day stuff, it was just boring.
Yeah, it gets worse in the last few hours. Like, the story gets significantly worse in the last few hours, like especially the ending. So it's better that you didn't finish it. Like, you finish it before it got worse. Like, you let it before it got worse. Okay. But I wanted to comment a bit about what you said earlier about the potential of video games in the future, perhaps to express spirituality. And the thing is that, to me, perhaps in the sense that to how I view video games themselves, the thing is that perhaps it's more intrinsic than just a thematic exploration of elements. Because when I think about this medium, I generally associate this medium with the incarnations of avatars in space, in a world, and in that sense we get to inhabit lives that aren't our own, and we create a
Hmm.
connection to our avatar's experiences. And there's an existential layer of immersion since we assume a new identity and a new manner of exploring our capability. And thus, in a video game, we're capable of internalizing experiences directly, and they transfer our mind, our identity, or perhaps even our soul into the spiritual body. We make decisions. And what I'm trying to get at is that when I'm trying to, and well, there are certain games uh, where um where we can perceive the traces of other people that they have left them there. For example, I remember reading once an anecdote of a person who used to play a racing game with his father, and that and the thing is that his father passed away, and many years later, when he put the game back on, he this you know that racing games, for example, save the ghost of the person who had the best time, right? And the thing is that this person returned to the game and found that his father's ghost was still in like the ghost of his father's best time was still there, and that playing with that ghost was kind of like playing with the last presence of his father in the world. And that's why even if he can defeat his father, he deliberately lets himself defeat by him so that the memory card still preserves his father as some sort of keepsake, but on a more intimate level, on a more potent connection, because it's a fragment of that person still living in there. And I don't know if you associate that to perhaps the belief of a soul manifest potentially manifesting itself in this medium, or something like that. I know it sounds a bit esoteric.
Yeah, that is a very complex idea that you're talking about. So let me comment on it from my perspective, based on my understanding, my interpretation of Scripture. I do think that one thing that has some validity here is that, you're talking about using avatars in video games, and I do think there is something to be said about how that can almost, it's like we're transferring ourselves into that avatar for a temporary time. And this goes back to like escapism, potentially, of
Yes.
course. Um, but I can see the idea that if you're spending so much time with as this avatar and fixated on this avatar, that it would be possible that your soul may have some connection to it. Now, would that be a good thing? That would be my first. If this is actually possible, would that be a good thing for you personally? If I'm talking about myself, I would argue no. And the
Mm-hmm.
reason why is because it gets back to my point earlier where I was talking about how the things of this world can be a distraction from our spiritual growth, our spiritual responsibilities, our spiritual duty. And I think if it were getting to the point where literally my soul is wrapped up into a game, um, again, assuming that's possible, that it wouldn't be necessarily a
A
good
good thing.
thing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, here's the thing. This story, though, that you told me about this person whose father, they were doing the best times, and then, you can race against the ghost, so to speak, which is something that I did a lot. I remember doing that in Mario Kart in particular.
Mm-hmm.
That's a very fascinating concept that this person wants that ghost to persist because it represents something about their loved one that they want to continue to hang on to. And I do think that okay, so I'll just go ahead and say it. So the father is definitely dead,
Yes.
obviously, and their soul. I don't know where their soul is. I don't think their soul is in that game.
Obviously.
You know, I think that like maybe like while you're playing it, there can be some like spiritually you are like I'm and again I'm thinking about it from like the cautionary perspective. Like maybe spiritually you can be in that game and it's because of the distraction element, you know. But as far as like after someone has died, I can't say where his father's soul actually is. Now, as far as like this idea of again racing the ghost, I can see why someone would do that for sure. Like I can totally understand why someone would do that because I've lost multiple loved ones in the last couple of years, and I think that is another thing that has inspired my own spiritual growth is that I lose people that are very dear to me, and you know it's tough. You know, like you want them to still be here, and you know as a Christian you're taught that one day you'll be reunited if they are also a believer.
Hmm.
And I think that I don't know, spiritually it's an interesting question. Should you concentrate on the ghost in the game, or should you concentrate on the potential reunion? You know, it really all depends on your spiritual perspective. But yeah, that's a very thank you for bringing that up because I had no idea that that was a story. But that just shows you the potential of video games because you know we've mainly been talking about games, artistic works. You know, what do
Yes.
they express to us? How do we interpret them? This is on another level though. This is like more like um, almost like I mean it's not quite like emergent narrative, you know, like what they talk about with like Breath of the Wild or something like that, where you know it's an open world and so you can kind of create your own story and that's you know and they call it emerging narrative. I don't like the term but that's what they call it. This is like sort of another form of that where you know you're the narrative is literally you like wanting to spend time with your lost father, and the way that you're doing that is playing this specific track or tracks in this racing game. I find that fascinating from that sort of emergent storytelling perspective. Um, but again, yeah, I'm still skeptical about whether we should, if it's possible, like assuming it is possible, I'm skeptical about whether that's a good thing about you know having some kind of spiritual attachment to it to a game.
I understand that. I was thinking that if there was a potential to uh, to create a spiritual attachment, in or perhaps in how to say it, perhaps strengthen your personal belief in the afterlife or in the idea of soul based on the presence that people that people live in their in these virtual worlds, then perhaps this could lead us to having a a presence with or at least a connection with with other people, or at least with other experiences, and well, that would lead to more in into to, because we have, as you said, we have been talking about video games as an artistic medium, as a manner of expression, but this could go to an intrinsic aspect of the medium to perhaps create some practice that could be either interpreted as spiritual or perhaps could be detrimental, because as you said, if we because as you said, it could potentially distract us as well.
Okay, yeah, and I think I see what you're saying more now because it's almost like you're saying that the video game, in a way, like with some intent and purpose, could almost be like some sort of tool to help someone along their spiritual journey. And of course, you know, we've already talked about your sister having that
Mhm.
experience with Earthbound, which I kind of consider that almost like a miracle of sorts that happened. You know, because you don't normally hear about that, but it sounds like you're talking about maybe the potential for people viewing games as like some sort of like spiritual tool. And you know, I don't want to completely dismiss that idea because after all, people think of books in the same way. You know, people will think of movies in the same way. Like I'm going to watch this particular film. Maybe it's a documentary, maybe it's a feature film with some sort of inspirational message. And this is going to, like, I'm not going to sit here and pick apart, the artistic execution of this particular film. I'm just going to use this as a tool to, like, broaden my, spiritual understanding or something like that. Am I kind of getting at what you were kind of talking about?
Um, yeah, yes, but you are skeptical about that, right?
I mean, I do have some skepticism about it, but again, like, it's not something that I would completely dismiss. It would just depend, I guess, upon the person, like, ultimately, because, here's the thing. I can't know the heart of someone. You know what I mean? Like I said earlier, the Bible even tells us that we don't truly know our own hearts
Mm-hmm.
by ourselves, that we need some connection to God to really get a good grip on that. So I don't want to dismiss this sort of potential, because I can't, if I don't know my own heart like I should, how can I pretend to know the heart of someone else in this sort of situation?
Right, and perhaps that's what I'm talking about. Uh, if the video game medium can potentially lead to a spiritual self discovery or something like that. For example,
Yeah.
there is this game which is called Ultima 4. I don't know if you have heard of it.
Ultima 4.
Yes.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Sure.
I'm familiar. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I've heard a couple of people mention it.
Okay, the thing is that in this game, to take control of a person who has already achieved the status of a hero. And the game is technically some sort of post RPG, in fact, because you have defeated evil and everything is over. And the question is, what do you do after having defeated evil? And the result is that you can decide to act like a moral person to set an example for other people to follow. And as you go through the world, discover how to act like a better person in this world. You avoid attacking others, you help poor people, etc. And ultimately, you go to the final area, which is the Stygian Abyss, at the end of the game, after you feel fulfilled. And at the center of it, because in order to become the avatar, you yourself must be pure in your heart. At the center of it, you come across in your mind with what's essentially the voice of God, the voice of God, and He asks you about everything you have learned about, and you reflect and have to actually answer Him back. And once you are done, you're able to return to the real world to face, well, to what the game implies is adulthood. That's something that I have in mind when I think of spirit of self discovery through this medium.
Oh, okay, yeah, yeah. And I think this example that you gave of Ultimate Four is maybe, as far as like my understanding is concerned, maybe it's a better example than the racing one, because I think the racing one, not to disparage that story, because I think it's a very fascinating one, and I'm glad I'm aware of it now. But I think the racing one is more talking about,
Emergent,
um,
as you
well,
said.
that, and also just, like, how do we cope with grief, which I think is a very relevant topic. Now, of course, my ultimate answer about the grief question is to ask for God's help
Mhm.
with dealing with it. It's obviously going to be hard no matter what. That's what a lot of people don't understand, is that, yeah, just because you ask for God's help doesn't mean that all the bad stuff's going to go away. It just means that it's going to, hopefully provide you with a path to get to a better place, to get to some semblance of peace. But now, when you're mentioning the Ultima Four game, I think that is something that it can help people think about things, I think, from a spiritual lens, and in that way, I mean, I think it's a proper comparison, I think, to Earthbound. Maybe it is. Earthbound obviously has a lot of elements to it. It has a lot of humor in it. It has a
Mhm.
lot of exploration in it. Whereas this Ultima 4 game, it seems like the entire premise is really about, having a focus on one's moral actions, and then explicitly tying it to, I guess, sort of like the judgment of a higher being.
Mm-hmm.
So I do think there's some potential value there, and and I really need to just reminds me I really need to get around to playing that game because I haven't played it, but I've of course heard a lot about it, and it would be really interesting. To throw something else out there at you, and I think this is an example that kind of maybe it just shows my Christian bias again, but I was kind of moved by Proteus
I know that game.
when I played through it, and that was another one where I felt like there was some. I thought there was some pretty explicit spiritual things about that game that people didn't necessarily emphasize when they were talking about it. And for me, the two things that stand out the most is at the very beginning of the game. It's as if you're walking on water.
Mm-hmm.
You don't like start the game on the island where you start interacting with the different creatures, and you start finding out how to basically cycle through the four seasons and that sort of thing. Like you're literally on the water and walking around, and but it doesn't even feel like. I know that when you're on the water in the game, it doesn't even feel like you're necessarily like walking on water. It's almost like you're floating across it too. So that immediately gets me thinking about a spirit. And then if we think about the Bible, I think about the story about Jesus walking on the water and Peter wanting to do the same thing. Well, then, later on in Proteus, as you learn how to get the seasons to cycle, because from what I understand with a lot of people's experience, not everyone, but a lot of people, that when they were playing Proteus, they didn't realize that you could like actually advance in the game. Like I think some people were under the impression that you kind of run around and interact and stuff, and that's the whole thing. But yeah, you can advance through the seasons, and then at the final part, you ascend to the heavens, and and even though that game really isn't explicitly talking about anything in the way that Ultima 4 does or in the way that Earthbound does, I still think that there is some potential value in that. But maybe with something like Proteus, though, it's almost like you have to come into it with some kind of spiritual standpoint. I don't know if Proteus would have the same potential, I guess, didactic potential as Ultima 4.
Right, and in Produce, for example, you another notion in that game is the connection of one with with nature, because the game has a contemplative aspect to it. Like it even lets you sit, if I remember correctly. Like it even lets you sit, and those are probably the two main actions that the game has, and like just walking or sitting, and it's it's kind of like the experience of someone just staying alone in around nature, and meditating about it, or meditating about it. And well, the game is short, so it's also evocative of the short nature of life, perhaps. So that's what I generally associate with when I think of Proteus and the concept of spirituality. That perhaps Proteus is kind of like a spiritual an abstraction of a spiritual practice.
Yes, yes, that's actually, I think that's a perfect way of putting it. It's definitely has more of an abstract approach to this type of subject matter, if indeed that's the interpretation that we have of it. Because I understand that other people may not, see Proteus in the same way,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, that's what I would take from it. I like the way that you put that there.
Mm-hmm. I think that if I had to mention probably the most potent spiritual experiences in video games to me, it would be ending E from Near Automata, perhaps. I think you have played Near Automata, right?
Oh yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, sure. Yeah, I remember you put it in your top 10 of the decade. And the ending E of Nier Automata is similar to Urban's ending, and in a sense, it's also its successor, sort of successor uh, of its of in a more modern setting. And it's also rooted in this notion of perceiving other people's traces, perceiving other people's of what other people leave behind. And the thing is that at the end of the game, after the game makes its argument of the inescapable nature of human conflict rooted in authoring and self-righteousness, the game sets you in the final confrontation against the abstract and metaphorical incarnation of predestined fate, while the song that is in the background sings about the will to keep fighting in this broken world, clamoring God to listen, and talking about prayers breaking through mountains and heavens, sung in different languages as a uniting force. And the game is a losing battle, and that part is a losing battle unless you are really good at bullet hell games, which I'm not anymore. I'm too old and rusty in video games by now, even if I am 24. And after losing multiple times and the game telling you to leave and give up and to accept that everything is really hopeless, you're and you're rejecting all of that. You are given the possibility to ask for help from outside, just like in Earthbound. Uh, and and you and when that happens, uh, there are support messages that show up in from other players in the world, as well as a boost in our capabilities that strengthen us enough to let us win. Our bullets are stronger, and whenever we are hit, one of the other players takes the bullet from us, and while the game informs us that their data was lost. And after the ending rolls, the game gives you the possibility of sending a message to another player for their own final battle, for which there are very mean-spirited possibilities. You can actually say very nasty things, but none of the messages that show up on screen seem to be nasty because everyone that gets to that point decides to not do that. Like they get the even if they have the possibility to be mean people, they don't do that. uh, and then you're offered the possibility to support the strength of another player in exchange of your saved progress, which reveals that the strength that you got at the last moment came from other people who sacrificed something for you, precious for them, for you, for a person they didn't know. And that's the final unimpeachable argument of the director of Taro Yoko in favor of perhaps mankind's possibility of changing their ways one day. That perhaps there one day we might act in love for our neighbors, and it wouldn't be possible. And this wouldn't be possible. Like all of this wouldn't be possible if this wasn't a video game. If we couldn't perceive other people's will and traces at that moment to make us really believe what the author is saying us, at least during that moment. And I think that's pretty revelatory of what video games can do on this regard.
You know, this is really interesting. I did not expect you to bring up this particular game, so I find this a very provocative part of the discussion here, and so kudos to you for bringing this up. Okay, so here's my take on this particular thing. I'm not as I'm not as fond of this particular ending
Okay.
for the game. As you know, there are many different endings,
Yeah.
and the one that I think my review of the game shows this. It's pretty clear that what I found most provocative about the game, or I guess most significant about the game, is how it puts you into um, sort of like it puts you into the shoes of a bigot, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And now some might be saying, well, do I really need to do that to understand that bigotry is wrong? Well, you probably, because I think what a lot of people miss is that we all at some point have ideas about people that are based on either broad assumptions on something that someone has said or something that maybe we've even seen in different entertainment forms and things like that, and it's unfair. And if you allow it to fester, you might end up like the male protagonist. His name is escaping me right now, but
9S.
yes, you might end up like 9S, to the point where you are just hell bent on destroying these people. So that's what I found the most compelling part of the game, and so for that, I would argue for that message that I'm talking about to have the most power, you would almost just need to not even attempt to get to the ending that you're talking about. I think for my point to come across the strongest. Now, having said that, if we're going to take the ending that you described on face value, here is my hesitation on it as like some sort of profound statement. And it's funny because I never thought about this comparison before, but as you were talking about it, another game came to mind, and that was last year's game from Kojima.
The Stranding.
The Yeah, Death Stranding, because does it not have a similar approach in that you know there's this idea that the world is really really bad. Of course, he puts it right there in the United States, which this gets to one of my things about Kojima that I just dislike about him as an artist is that he's always talking about the United States, but I don't feel like he really understands the United States. Like that's my. I know this is kind of tangential, but I just want to throw that out there. I think one of the major limitations of him as an artist is that he has almost like a child's view of the United States. It's almost like you're a child and you learn about, Guantanamo Bay or something, and then you make ground zeros. It's like, dude, come on, man. Like, I'm an adult. I'm an adult American. Please just don't try to act like you know something. So I find him pretentious, and so, but the reason I bring that up too is that I do think there's some pretension to this idea of, okay, well, only a video game can do this. Well, I mean, maybe that's true, if that is what Taro and Kojima, if that's what they're arguing. But I still wonder what the real value in it is because, with the idea of, giving up your save file, for instance. I mean, yes, that is a sacrifice, but why? But why is it a sacrifice? That's what I would ask. Because what is a save file? All it is just keeping progress of your game. Is there anything really that meaningful about a save file outside of what the industry tells you to care about? The industry wants you to think that your save file is precious, that all of your content is precious. That's why they keep doing these new game pluses all the time. Like, we can't even let a game end anymore. It has to be never ending, and you have to keep going deeper and deeper. Oh, and here's a season expansion. All this crap that they throw at you. They want you to place value on things like, your progression through this content. And so I think that's what the save file represents. And I just don't see, for that specific example, if we're, because, another thing this brings to mind, this ending, is the sacrifice of Christ. This idea that Christ laid down his life for all of us so
Mm-hmm.
that through grace we can attain salvation, that we can actually be in congregation with God, be in conversation with God, that, it doesn't have to be this thing where, you know, oh, we're just looking up into the sky and just hoping he's there. This is like where, we can actually have some sort of direct relationship with him. And Christ literally gave up his life. He suffered, was tortured, for a long time, for this to happen. Well, to me, I do think of that when I think about this ending to Near Automata, but it's like, but the save file, it, I mean, I know that there's like a comparison there, but to me, it kind of falls apart because of what I just said, because the industry wants us to care about the save file. Like the save file is supposed to be sacred, and quite frankly, it's not. So I'm not as captivated by the sacrifice element there for that reason. And the other thing too is that I think that we have to be careful, and this is just my opinion from a
Mm-hmm.
philosophical and spiritual angle, that that through video games and through like the goodness of our hearts, because one thing I thought was really interesting about your description was that you said that you could potentially type in a nasty message to someone and that could be what they see, but they're not, but based on a lot of people's anecdotal, at their anecdotes, this is not happening. But is this really getting to any sort of like real spiritual thing, or is this more about? My question is this more about humankind, kind of, what's the right word? Kind of like making itself feel better about itself, like, hey, we actually are all pretty good when you get down to it. I think that's the message of Death Stranding too. It's like, we're all in this together, even though everything sucks, humanity deep down is actually good, and this game will prove it. Here, you can like this bridge that, you know, you can like it just like the Twitter and the Facebook gurus tell you to. You can like this bridge, and man, we're going to make it. I think there is something to say about this, that there's some caution I think that we need to take with this. But again, that's just my perspective on it. Like I said, I've always been more impressed by the attention to bigotry that was in that game of Nier Automata, rather than that ending. And I do recognize that a lot of people found that ending profound, but like looking back at it, a few years later, I don't know if it really changed anyone. And like I said, I worry that these types of games where we're supposed to be all connected, and we're all helping each other out, I almost wonder if we're just kind of, again, we're just kind of like building ourselves up and talking about, hey, we actually are great. Like, we don't have sin. We're not bad people. We actually are great. We're doing it through our own means too, through the video game. There can be some potential negativity involved with that, I guess, because where I'm coming from is that, even though I am a Christian, I don't necessarily think of myself as a good person, if that makes sense. Like, I don't necessarily look at myself as any better than someone who doesn't believe, because ultimately I still do things that are not right, just like those people. And so again, it gets back to this kind of mercy concept, this idea of the deity having mercy on us, and us, like, admitting that, we have faults. So that's my take on it.
Okay, interesting, because this is the first time I actually listened to that sort of take, and perhaps you're right about the caution, the cautionary, like to have caution with that notion, uh, because I never reflected on that aspect, but uh, but nevertheless, people still put importance to their well, not necessarily their save file, but rather perhaps the time they spent with the game, or the experience they had, and all of that getting lost. And and well, perhaps that's not as, I don't think it's a parallel to Christ's sacrifice, but perhaps but nevertheless, it's some sort of something they had to give up, and well, perhaps you're right that there is a potential caution with that. With that, yeah. What did you want to say?
I was going to say that I do recognize that, and you said this is your first time hearing this take. It's the first time that I've publicly stated it, because again, I didn't, I wasn't as floored by the concept, and I was much more, I guess, fascinated by what I was talking about in my review of the
Yes,
game.
sure.
But I do recognize that, um, there are even some cynics out there that were touched by that part of the game. So does my interpretation mean that no good really came out of it? Not necessarily. But all I can do is just offer, I guess, my genuine thoughts on it, and that's pretty much all it
No, no, no.
was.
It's no. It's okay. It's fine. I just was
Yeah.
surprised. I was just surprised, but I just was surprised because I didn't see it coming, but I didn't see it coming. But nevertheless, you are.
Well, hey, that's the great thing about criticism, is that you can go into these corners that you never expected. Just like I said, I didn't expect you to bring up the game. Honestly, it was a curveball, and but I'm glad you did, because it got me thinking about it in a different way. I'd never, up until this conversation, I had not thought about Death Stranding in the context of Nier Automata, but now I'm seeing a line, which I think is something that I would like to maybe think about more, in the future.
Yes, in my case at least, what happened in my case, okay, how do you express it? In my case, the thing is that I don't think that I perceive Nier Automata of some sort of pat in the back for make people feel better, because the game already recognizes that we are probably not good people in general, but rather that it incites that people can perhaps act well to each other, like that there is the possibility of acting well, even if it accepts that it's not it, it's not what happens right now. Do you get what I mean?
Yeah, no, and that's a fair point. That even if we take into account what we both believe, that maybe humankind isn't inherently good, that it's certainly capable in maybe certain, um, I guess, certain circumstances that maybe we wouldn't necessarily expect it. Even, like maybe based on previous behavior, we wouldn't expect this person to actually do the right thing in this moment. But then for whatever reason, while they're playing this game, because maybe I'm making reference to someone who normally is very attached to save files. Like even if I question whether that's even right or not, obviously I think it's a bit wrong, I guess. But maybe this person is the kind of person who usually keeps all of their files very neatly and everything like that, and it's something that's very important to them. For that person to finally part with it, maybe that does say something about them. So the possibility is certainly there. I just have some what I would call healthy skepticism.
No, it's right, because it's right that perhaps that people could apply a lot of value to that safe, or at least to a material possession, uh,
Right.
like some sort of material possession, but
I mean, I guess that's and that just triggered a thought. I mean, because you mentioned John the Baptist earlier. One of those people that came up to him for guidance. They asked him specifically, what should we do? And he did say in one of the verses in Luke, the book of Luke, where he says, if you have two coats, give one of them to someone who needs it. And so, if you look at like the spirit of that verse, you could conceivably argue that Near Automata is sort of like playing off of I guess, like maybe the philosophy of that verse. You have this material possession. In this case, it's a digital file, so it's not even material, so to speak. But we can at least entertain like the comparison, and yeah, and you're actually giving it up altogether. I mean, like that's it. Like that's your entire experience with the game. Especially in a context where, like I said, it seems like games just don't want to end. They want you to keep playing them. They want New Game Plus. They want you to keep doing that. So for someone to
give
give
up
that
that.
up, yeah, maybe it does sort of speak to the philosophy behind that John the Baptist thing. But it's something to consider for sure.
Okay, so I think we have gotten to an interesting point in the conversation. Uh, so this leads me to ask, what is it that you think that could be done to change the paradigm that segregates spiritual appreciation from this medium? Like, what do you think that could be done?
Yeah. Well, it gets back to one of our earlier points. Spirituality ultimately is something that involves personal decisions.
Mm-hmm.
So, in an ideal world, you would have audiences and artists coming to grips with the idea that, hey, there's more to it than just the material world, than just the world that humankind has erected and has placed value on. And then maybe you would start seeing, some demand games that address these sorts of things. And maybe you would see more artists who are driven to go in this direction. But I have to fall back again on what I said earlier too, in that you know I don't know if there's anything I can do that can change the paradigm, so to speak. it's almost like this has to come about naturally as part of people's spiritual progression. And that's one thing that's never that is never like a certain thing. So you take someone like me, like there's no reason that there's no like determining reason that says Jed definitely has to be a Christian right now. Even though I was raised in a church, even though my parents are constantly still talking about, how they interpret the Bible and what they think is important. Even though there are all these different signs that I feel like I've seen, whether it's when I'm talking with someone or when I feel like I'm going through a particularly difficult time, and then I feel like a weight lifted off my shoulders after I read some scripture or something like that. Even with all that in mind, there's no guarantee that that I, Jed Pressgrove, should still be a Christian. So yeah, there is no. I don't know if there's any kind of deterministic way of going about this to change the status quo, so to speak. I was curious if you had any thoughts about this.
Well, the only thing that I thought about was that perhaps we need more people to talk about it like openly, because
Right.
you talk about it openly, because the general impression that I get with this topic is that people just try to make everything neutral. Like they try to, like, for example, with politics, it's a general, it's known that video game people try to segregate video games from politics, and I feel that when it comes to religion, it's something similar, that people uh, don't want to feel categorized, or they want to standardize game discourse. But we need more variety, because because this medium is a personal medium, and perhaps having more people to talk about these topics openly could help other people to be more open about this.
That's a really good point, and I do think there's value in the conversation that we're having. At the very least, regardless of whether any listeners get any value from this, whether they're religious or not, I take a lot of value in it just because I like getting to know more about your perspective, and then having the opportunity to share mine. And this, don't get me wrong, I mean this conversation, I will think about it for sure, well after it's over, thinking about a lot of the things that we talked about and wondering, is there something that I should adjust based on what we talked about? That's the kind of direction that my mind might go. So at the very least, to me, this discussion has a lot of value. But on a broader level, yeah, I mean, people should be open for sure. And it makes me wonder whether maybe some people are bashful, perhaps, or are reluctant to be as open. And I do know also when we're talking about criticism, especially when you get down to like things like reviews, where you have review codes that are sent out, and a company may not want to give a publication codes anymore if you negatively review too many of their games or something like that. um, I think this kind of environment definitely makes people a little hesitant to share really what they're thinking. I'm not saying that this is always the case, but you would just think that there would be more diversity of opinion out there, because I know that when I'm just talking to people, like I'm talking to you now, like I'm just I'll call up a friend and talk to them about some popular game, and a lot of times they'll have a perspective that I haven't even seen in the critical space, so to speak.
Hmm.
And that makes me wonder whether there's a reason for that. Like, is there like a fear of talking about certain things? I know politically, for sure,
Yes.
there are probably people who are afraid of talking about some of their ideas, because there is a lot of political dogma out there now that's saying that, regardless of whatever side it's coming from, where if you say something that is not in line with what this particular ideology believes, then you should be shamed, that you should be shouted down. And obviously, there are certain things that I won't compromise on. For instance, when it comes to like if there was like a Nazi game room, for example, I would not want to entertain their perspective, as it pertains to like how they view humankind, because there's nothing redeemable about the Nazi perspective. But if we're just talking about maybe just someone who's conservative and not a Nazi, I would think that certain conservative critics would be perhaps fearful of really saying some of the things they believe. And I'm not sitting here trying to say, well, let's feel sorry for the conservative critics who feel like they can't talk as much. I'm not saying that at all, because I'm not really a conservative. I mean, I don't think that if you look at like what I believe, I'm not a huge fan of. I'm not a huge fan of money from philosophical. I mean, even though I understand that I need it, and I have to work for it in order to make it in this society, I'm not necessarily a big fan of it. So yeah, I hope no one misinterprets me as like trying to say, well, feel sorry for someone who's conservative not saying something. I'm just trying to make a general point
Mm-hmm.
that I don't think people are being as open as they could be about things, whether it comes down to spirituality, comes down to politics. I think that a lot of people are afraid of being shouted down and shamed. Now, there's a difference between being shamed and shouted down and just being criticized. Like if you say something and you're open about it, I think that being criticized for it, that's fine. Like, so if someone listens to this podcast and they say, well, Jed, he was saying all this stuff about God, and honestly, I just think it's just, I just think it's a bunch of make believe. You know, if they said that, I don't have a problem with that because it's their right to say that. Now, if they're going to start like trying to um, harass me about my beliefs and, constantly send me, disparaging remarks and, uh, trying to influence, you know, maybe a publication that I would write for and say, how can you let like this religious wacko, write for you? Yeah, that's a problem right there because you shouldn't do that in a free society. You should allow the marketplace of ideas to occur, and then you should criticize, but don't act like you're so holy that you can't take a different perspective. And again, there are exceptions to the rule. You know, uh, these wannabe Nazis or actual Nazis. That's just one example. Yeah, let's keep them out of the discussion because I don't think they have anything valuable. But if it's just like someone that has, well, I mean, there's also left wing people that don't go as like that aren't as critical of things that you would think based on some of their beliefs. If you talk to them one, they don't go as hard on games for things that they don't like. Um, Now, is it all self censorship? Some of it could be editors are influencing what they're saying. Like maybe the writer wanted to say this, but then the editor says, "Hey, can you maybe like soften the blow on this a little bit?" That's the kind of stuff that I hate. Is when an editor just wants you to soften the blow always. That's just, man, that's just cowardice. I mean, that's just pure cowardice. I mean, I don't like it. I've never liked it. I never will.
I understand. Perhaps I understand. I don't like either uh, to not express myself like I wish to, like to give my honest thoughts even if they are harsh. Because I think that people should be direct and honest with their thoughts, like because if you have thoughts, you should express them like the way you think of them. Okay. This has been so far an enlightening talk yet. Now, perhaps as like some sort of closure, I would like to read some of the questions on Twitter. Uh,
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
yeah, okay. Basco03 asks too if we could mention three examples of games that that ref, reflect that. But I think we have already mentioned some of our own
Hmm.
examples. You have mentioned Earthbound, you have mentioned Proteus, and you have mentioned the Shiva as well. And I have talked about Ultima 4. I have talked about perhaps my experience with specifically the ending of Nier Automata. Not necessarily the whole game. The whole game isn't about that.
Right.
Yeah, but specifically with the ending. And I also have talked about well, about Mother 3 too, even if briefly. Uh, I could also mention, even if I could also mention, I think you aren't as fond of this game as I am, but but Quintet's games in the the studio Quintet used to make games in the 90s, which dealt with the cycle of creation, and the first game they made was one called ActRaiser, which was specifically about the relationship of people with God through a simulation game, and the ending of that game pretty much was about how people left left attending to left attending to temples or churches once they had a satisfied life. Like once they got to a commoditized life, they eventually stopped attending the temples at the end of the game.
Yeah, and I played through ActRaiser back in the day when I was a teenager, and I don't even remember the narrative so much as the combination of action platforming and simulation, and I don't have much to offer. I guess from a spiritual perspective on ActRaiser, the only thing I will offer is just my assessment of the game at the time, which was that it combined two genres, but I felt that its handling of both action platforming and simulation was mediocre.
Yeah,
But that's the
it
only
was
thing that
yeah, it was pretty
yeah,
simple.
that's the only thing I can add to that though. But I do remember those themes vaguely that you're talking about. But it's just been so long since I've played it.
Yeah, I played it as a child actually, and well, I think that perhaps a child watching that ending could have something to think about because the games were like back then, like the console games used to be made for a younger audience.
Right.
Even Earthbound, even if Earthbound has something really meaningful to say, it was aimed at younger audiences too. Even if it has something special for people who are grown up and can understand it a little better, or can express it a little better. And I think that at the very least, watching the ending of ActRaiser could give someone someone of that age, something to think about.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
Okay, now there is another user called Danny Canovas Lotto, and he has three questions for us.
Okay, and I know this guy. I like him.
Yeah, I like him too. He appeared on the podcast too a couple of times.
Oh, okay.
hmm
Okay.
The first one is for somebody who likes to write about video games but doesn't talk about their spiritual condition all that much. He wants to ask how it feels like, or if there are specific genres that make you perceive these elements more.
Um so how would you interpret that question exactly?
Okay, that's the problem because I have tried to understand the question properly as well. It was written in Spanish, but nevertheless, I think that he means that for some because I don't know if he means himself when or if he means us, but
Mhm.
perhaps he's asking how it feels like to talk about the spirit about the spiritual condition of the spirituality on itself, like how it feels like.
Yeah, I guess in a general sense, I feel like talking about this is something that I'm called to do. You know, it's not just a matter of, well, I just happen to be spiritual and here you go. I do think that there is something within me that is a conviction that says, hey, you do need to share. Um, you do need to share your experiences, and you need to share what you see as both good and bad from a spiritual perspective, and also just being able to be on this podcast and really go into detail about it means the world to me because there's a lot of things that I haven't really gone as much into detail about that I've been able to do here.
Mm-hmm.
And then also because you're such a great interviewer, you did a great job preparing for this conversation. You brought some things into play that I didn't necessarily expect, and it made me think about things in a different way. And and so yeah, I feel good about talking about it because like I said, if you feel like you're called to do something and then you actually act on that, I think you should feel good about it. Now, should you feel satisfied? No, I always feel like I could have done more when it comes to talking about these types of things. You know, so someone might look at me and say that I'm one of the most openly religious people, you know, in this space. But to me, that's not like an honor. You know, like I don't look at that as like an award or something. To me, I'm always asking, okay, maybe I am, but what else can I do? And I feel like this podcast is like kind of taking it to the next level. Like I've already talked about some of these things in different articles whenever they come up, and now this is the opportunity for me to like really put on full blast like why this is important. And yeah, I think that's my answer.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully that answers the question
Yeah.
satisfactorily.
The he also asked if there are specific genres of video games that make you perceive spiritual elements more.
I think that the role playing genre is the obvious answer here. I
Yeah.
mean, most of the games that we've talked about have, you know, either fallen into that category or have some relationship with that genre. I mean, obviously, well, you know, you have the point and click adventure there too. I guess ultimately, maybe genre doesn't. Maybe I spoke too soon there. Maybe genre doesn't necessarily mean as much here. Maybe it's more about like how open the artist is, you know, because the guy who did the Shiva, and his name is escaping me right now. I feel bad because he's done a number of games. You know, the fact that he's able to kind of go out on a limb and put that out there, I think that really is the determining factor. I don't think there's a particular genre that would necessarily have a stranglehold on it. Now, obviously, would it be more challenging in certain contexts? Like if you were playing, I guess, a platformer, a 2D platformer, would it be maybe more challenging to express profound ideas that pertain to spirituality? Yeah, sure. So I think it's like maybe it's easier to do it when you have something like an RPG or maybe a point and click adventure. But yeah, I think the determining angle here is ultimately the artist. So you never want to limit what an artist can do as far as like how they might reinterpret a genre and then make it do something that you didn't think was possible.
Yeah, that I agree. It's true. I think that you're right that most of the examples that we have covered have been uh, mostly narrative oriented games. But even something like Ultima 4, there was something different about that game because that game is
Right.
about even if it's a role playing game, it's about it's very open. Like this, the story is just the story on itself, like as a story itself, it's very simple. You just try to become a better person and go to the abyss and purify yourself. uh, but there's not that much going on, but there's something still on there, and Proteus has like has no explicit
Right.
narrative.
Yeah, and yet despite that, it definitely said something to me.
Mm-hmm.
So it does make me wonder what might be around the corner. You know, maybe there is a platformer out there that will eventually make me go, whoa, you know, this is doing some stuff that I've never really seen before. That's, you know, talking about someone's faith. It doesn't have to be about Christian faith. I mean, obviously, again, I have that bias because I do think that Jesus is the answer. But you know, if there's a platformer out there that, you know, decides to have a very explicit you know, Islamic message, or one that decides to explore you know, things from the perspective of like a Sikh example, that could be very fascinating to experience.
Well, I know a horror game which is called Fates. I don't know if you have heard of it.
No, I don't think I've played that.
Okay, it's a horror game that has an old school aesthetic. Like it looks like really old, like a really old 80s game, but it's actually uh, from 2017 or something like that. And the idea with that game is that you control a priest who has a cross, and the thing is that whenever the cross is the only action you have. Using the cross is the only action you have in that game, and whenever and well, there are certain menaces, or there are certain scenarios that could frighten you, but and using the cross is your only protection against it, even if you don't know when something is coming up or not. And that's a horror game. That's supposed to be a horror game, but even something like that includes elements from elements of faith, or belief in something in something special. If you I don't,
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
so the possibility is always open. Okay, the Lotto asks too if there are more facets of life that influence your writing, such as or other personal tastes or your own job. I think that's quite a personal question, but if you wish to answer, you are free to do so.
So things in my life that influence my writing other than spirituality. I think that's what he's getting at.
Yes.
Okay. I would say that it's impossible to not have other elements of one's life to influence their writing, and it reminds me of, I think it's a quote from, I believe it's Federico Fellini. If it's not, then, and I don't think he was the only person to say this, but I want to say there was a Fellini quote out there, something to the effect of all art is autobiographical. And I definitely think that, because I view criticism as an art. I
Yeah.
don't say that to say, I don't mean to, put on a special cap and say, oh, look at me, I'm the artiste or anything like that. But I do view criticism as an art form. So because it is a form of writing, and so yeah, there are a lot of things that influence it. I do think that sometimes and it can influence it in ways that don't necessarily translate to the message. For instance, the type of job that I have can influence my writing. So if I'm working in a job that doesn't really involve writing, that doesn't really involve editing, then I might be able to be more productive with my personal writing, from which I've made, very little money.
Hmm.
Which that's not the point, but that's just the reality. But then if I'm working in a job as I am right now, where my responsibilities do involve primarily writing, that can influence how productive I'm going to be. That is, I think, one of the reasons why I kind of wanted to take a step away from Game Bias, my blog, for some time, is because my full time position now requires me to write a lot of articles for publication, and of course it has nothing to do with video games. So although it might at some point. I could see the subject coming up. Maybe not a video game. Maybe it'd be more like virtual reality, because I write a lot about technology. But so yeah, so it will things in my life influence me in explicit ways, such as my spirituality, and then also in other ways that are not as obvious, like just the circumstances of my life. And it would take a long time to go through all those things, I think.
Yes, I think that if I try to out, the list will be un how to say it, infinite. The list would be infinite, because I would because a lot of things that happen in my life would obviously influence the way I perceive things. Uh, that's why writing, especially criticism, is something that is very personal, because a lot of things influence
Right,
you.
right. And we also think about what about our very experience with writing about video games. So what I'm talking about is, earlier in the conversation, much earlier, I was talking about reading gaming magazines. and wanting to do that, like reading it and thinking, hey, this is pretty cool, I should do that.
Mm-hmm.
I think that inspiration has helped shape the way that I write about games, the way that I write about the field of game criticism in general. And the reason why, and again, I'm mainly, when I talk about this, like right now, I'm mainly referring to like reviews, for example, because I think reviews, they're like, that's like the way to, that's the way to like spread the word about games. When you get down to
Mm-hmm.
it, that's the type of essay where you can reach a really wide swath of people.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a shame to me that when you look at reviews from when I was reading gaming magazines now, there really hasn't been much progress made. And so if you ever read my work and you can see some bitterness about that fact, that bitterness would not be there if I didn't have that history with those gaming magazines. Like, my thought is that we should be light years beyond that enthusiast press of the 1990s, and we're really not that far away from it when you get down to it. I mean, obviously it's the same. I do think there is more diversity out there. You know, the writing staff back then, they were mainly made up of white males, for example, white American males. And now, of course, you have a lot more people from different backgrounds and such writing, and I think that's great. But at the same time, I still want to see again that openness we were talking about. I still want to see more of that. And again, there are examples of that out there. I'm not saying that no one does that. There are plenty of, if you really want to look for them, there are definitely good writers out in this space. But I just think, like, when I think about it from a broad perspective, I just feel like it should have moved a lot farther along than what it has. And I do understand some of the reasons why, but you know, there's a part of me that's such an idealist. I'm always thinking about, well, how can we fight against the default status? So yeah, that's just another factor there.
Okay, the last question is in regards to music. I think
Okay.
he says, "Is it difficult to talk about music? For example, there are games that we don't imagine without music, but I think he says it's difficult to explain why, and then he asks if we find music connected to spirituality. If a game without it can have spirituality, even then it's I'm trying my best to translate the question.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think it's a very good question. And I'll have to address it in a couple of different ways. One, do I find it difficult to write about music? I find that there is a challenge to writing about music as opposed to writing about, say, film, writing about just, you know, the mechanics of a video game. Like, music is, that's an entire art form. And yeah, it's challenging because you have to decide, well, what are you going to focus on? Are you going to focus on music from a technical angle, like, you know, why they're doing it in this key and what emotional significance does that have? Are you going to do it more like, kind of like in an approachable level where, you know, you can make references to what you're hearing in a way that people can just generally understand? You know, you know, is it just as simple as saying, man, I just really like this guitar riff here? You know, there's a lot of different ways that you can go about it. I do think that most of the time when you look at the way that game critics talk about music just in their reviews and stuff, a lot of times it doesn't get to the meaning of the music, and I do think that's a disservice. I think that there needs to be more concentration on what the music is making you feel and why it makes you feel that way. And I've tried to do that in a number of pieces. I don't do it in every review because I'm of the opinion that I don't believe in like this idea that you have to cover particular aspects of a game in every review. That's a checklist mentality that I don't subscribe
Mhm.
to. That's again, that's going back to the enthusiast gaming press of the '90s, and I don't know as much about the '80s because I was too young to read magazines then. But when you're going to the '90s, that's how they would do. They would always talk about the music, but it would always be in like these very kind of general terms, you know. Um, So I have tried to talk about some of the cultural and emotional things that the music is saying to me, but I don't necessarily do it for every game. It's just when I find it particularly compelling, I'll add it in there. Now, as far as the music as related to spirituality, yeah, I mean, music can definitely have an impact on whether a game's spiritual impact, like the I guess the degree of its spiritual impact. And I'm thinking about something right now. That game, Everybody's Gone to Rapture. There was some music in that game that was quite powerful. I felt that I felt that it was really evoking some spiritual feelings. Unfortunately, the game, while it attempted to fulfill this promise of, well, I don't even know if it attempted. I mean, it makes reference to the rapture, but it doesn't really ever seriously dissect it. So I feel like in that case, like the music was where it was supposed to be, but the game really didn't live up to the potential of its music. So yeah, music can be important to a spiritual message in a game. Now, now I don't know if I'm understanding the last part of the question as well, but if part of the question is, does it absolutely need music to have some spiritual message? No, it doesn't.
No,
It,
obviously.
it doesn't require it, but it can certainly enhance something about the game in that regard, or detract from it. I mean, if you're trying to express some sort of spiritual idea, but you're playing some kind of you know corny folk music or something like that, which I know some people associate folk music in a more positive way. So again, that's where you get into like the eye of the beholder thing. Like what music says to one person, it may not say it to me. So I'm not saying I dislike all folk music, but I find a lot of it very grating. And so I don't necessarily feel spiritually aroused, if that's even an acceptable term, when I'm hearing folk music, unless it's just really, if I feel like it's very well executed. So yeah, it can definitely have an effect.
Okay, it's cool that you talk about all of this because, to be honest, I'm not the most educated person in music when it comes to music, unfortunately. Uh, However, when I think of the implementation of music in when it comes to spirituality, there's a scene in Mother 3 in particular that that comes to mind for some reason, which is uh, which is when there's a band where one of the members has to leave, and the other members sing some sort of prayer in musical form, telling the asking God to take care of his friend. And I found that detail really neat really neat, and I thought that uh, and it also made me think on that at that moment if there was a connection between spirituality and or at least between faith and music. Well, people have used music to express their own faith, but if there's something more intimate on that regard, if there is perhaps some yeah, is there something more intimate in that regard, especially because music is some sort of personal expression as well.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, well, you think about all of the gospel music out there. Again, just sticking to the Christian faith because that's what I know the most about. You look at that. I mean, that has a very important part. That plays a very important part in the history of Christianity. And also, if you look in the Bible, there are different verses that talk about making a joyful noise and these sorts of things. And so I do think that when it comes to music, maybe there is something more inherently spiritual about music than other art forms. I mean, I know that's kind of like that might be controversial, but if you look at it from a scriptural standpoint, it's not like, when I'm reading the scripture, it's not saying, hey, make sure that you paint a painting to praise God. It never, to my knowledge, it doesn't say that. Now, it's not saying that you can't do that. You can certainly paint something to bring glory to God or whatever else you worship. But yeah, the Bible specifically talks about music. So I do think that there is something sacred there. and do we always capitalize on it? It reminds me of a lot of the music that comes out now that's called Christian music, like praise music. I don't know if you're familiar with this form that's very popular in the United States, but it's I find it to be in a lot of cases very superficial. I find that it doesn't have the staying power of a lot of the more classic Christian songs throughout time, and I feel like a lot of it is because the praise music is just it's just about repetition, like for the sake of repetition. It's like like one song will be like God is awesome. I'm just throwing something out there. The song will be God is awesome, and you just literally say God is 20 times in a row. Um, okay, I'm not saying that someone can't draw something emotionally powerful from that, and maybe it inspires them in some way. But for me, it doesn't do much for me because the lyrics aren't really telling me why.
Mm-hmm.
It's just kind of like making a general declaration, and then just playing into this whole idea that hey, you have a chorus. A chorus is repetition. Just keep doing it over and over again. Like there's something very superficial to me. So I tend to, when it comes to the Christian music that I'm familiar with, I tend to side with those hymns because the lyrics, more often than these praise songs, they really are getting into the meat of like the human experience and why that human experience relates to God or drives us toward God. And so yeah, I think there's a lot to be talked about when it comes to music. And to go back to the commenter's earlier part of the question, where there are certain games that you can't even think about without the music. There are games that get way more credit than they deserve just because they have good music. I'm utterly convinced of this. And one example, a lot of them are Super Nintendo era. Actually, I
Yes.
would say, like, you look at F-Zero. Look, the original F-Zero. There is nothing special about that game. Once you play through a couple of levels, you've done it. I mean, there's just not much there. I mean, it's just not very. It's not very compelling as a racing game. I mean, it's just not, especially when you compare it to the F-Zero game that came out on GameCube. That's an exhilarating game. That's one of the best racing games ever. But the one on Super Nintendo is just kind of like, well, blah. I mean, yeah, I know it looks futuristic for the time, but it's just, it's just not much going on here. But man, the music is just incredible. I mean, I can't say that everyone shares my opinion about the actual experience of playing the game, but I have this theory that F-Zero would not be as popular if its music sucked. Just because, to me, that's the main reason to play the game is to hear those tracks.
Mm-hmm. I understand. Okay. I think we can close up the podcast with this. I thank you so much, Jed, for coming to talk about this and give your thoughts on this topic. It has been amazing to have you here.
Well, Ronaldo, I'm humbled that you asked me to speak about this, and I really do thank you for the opportunity. And it really the pleasure has been all mine. And if you're ever interested in talking again about something, I would always be down. And to everyone who is listening, I just want you to know, no matter who you are, I really do appreciate you, and I hope that our conversation gets you to think about things a little bit, regardless of whether it changes your mind or not. As long as it makes you think, that's really all that I'm aiming for. And I love everyone. I mean, I really do try to I try to live up to the example that Christ set.
Mm-hmm.
Even when you dislike someone, you should still love them. You should still see their humanity, and you should still forgive them. And so I feel that way about everyone. And I'm just glad to be.
Okay, I also aspire to the same to be to try to be as try to become like to be to follow Christ's example as well and try to uh, help other people to know more about Christ and actually try to be like him. uh,
Yeah,
anyway,
it's hard. It's
yes,
hard, but it's worth doing though. It's worth trying.
it's worth trying. Anyways, thanks to everyone too who has listened to this podcast. I hope you have a fantastic day, buddies. Goodbye and until next time.